Chapter 606. In the face of such a serious reason, Russell found himself speechless. The illusory figure had dissipated again, turning into a pitch-black bird. It spread its wings and nimbly passed through layers of blockades and defenses. It flew across a long distance and returned to the sky of the ivory tower. After finding the right position, it fell down. It penetrated through layers of walls. It descended from the sky and came to the tightly sealed alchemy workshop. Then, it saw the riot of darkness. Despair was shrinking. Under the transformation of the alchemy fire and the hand of imprisonment, it gradually changed qualitatively and took shape again, in Huai Shi's hand. Between his 5 fingers that had turned into steel, the originally heavy iron ingot had condensed into an illusory outline, which he held tightly. In the forger's furnace, the source substance and the iron began to transform again. Gradually, it became clearer and clearer. The outline of a sharp blade appeared. At that moment, the countless despair that was madly multiplying and spreading in the air suddenly shook. Then, it was pulled by an invisible force, collapsing and contracting inwardly. The sharp sound of steel growing burst forth. In Huai Shi's hand, the metal crystal was multiplying, moving forward and extending rapidly. Despair was given a body, hatred was given a blade, and curses were given a form. The darkness disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. And with the burning of the alchemy fire, in Huai Shi's hand, a pitch-black sharp blade finally appeared with its own ferocious outline. The wail of the secret instrument cracking spread. The sharp aura came from it, and in the blink of an eye, it brought a chilling sense of oppression. It was as if there were tangible slashes bursting out from the ground and walls. Oh! Usually, Du did not care about the sharp aura leaking from the secret instrument. He widened his eyes and stepped forward, almost lying in front of the boundary, staring at the weapon in Huai Shi's hand. How fierce, how wonderful! A sharp blade that can compete with the Muramasa. Is this the technology left behind by the forgers? The old man's eyes burned with fanatical flames, staring at the sharp blade in Huai Shi's hand that was gradually dimming. He was so excited that he almost danced with joy. In the flowing darkness, a cold and slender blade appeared from Huai Shi's hand and extended forward. After crossing an exaggerated scale, it outlined a sharp outline. That was a tachi. But even if it was a tachi, this length was too exaggerated. With just a glance, Yi Zichen was able to get the exact data. 7 feet 9 inches 6 fun. The old alchemist's eyes swept across the blade, staring at every detail on it. Is this the shape of the Imperial God's sword? It's truly an eye-opener. However, before he could finish his sentence, a cracking sound was heard from Huai Shi's hand. Everyone froze in place. In Huai Shi's hand, the odachi, which was astonishingly long, had actually shattered. It broke from the middle, and then shattered into thousands of pieces, flying in all directions, quickly blurring and dimming. In the end, it disappeared without a trace. Ping Du stood rooted to the ground, as if he had been petrified. He found it hard to accept such an outcome. Failed? No, it's the opposite. In the corner, Fei Niao's silhouette smiled. It's a success. At that moment, Huai Shi finally raised his hand. The banner unfolded, and the bone-burying sanctuary opened with a bang. The billowing darkness accompanied by the overwhelming tide of steel crows roared out. But this time, the crow tide that blotted out the sky and covered the earth no longer reflected the metallic light. Instead, it had returned to the chaotic darkness of the past. However, this darkness was far too ferocious. The once desperate frenzy emerged again. The steel crows spread their wings, and their bodies were wrapped in a substantial darkness. Their scarlet eyes were full of ferocity. When they hissed, the sharp sound tore through the fragile protection and spread in all directions. Greedy predation. In the blink of an eye, within hundreds of meters of the entire laboratory, all the abyssal sediment, all the unknown things, and all the creeping erosive species lurking in the shadows were completely devoured by the crows. And when Huai Shi raised his hand, the mighty tide of crows gathered. After the shackles of the form were undone, countless heavy steel feathers fell and returned to Huai Shi's hand again. The texture of the feathers overlapped, forming a complicated and solemn blade pattern. The blade that grew and extended like a machine formed a slender arc. The ferocious blade appeared again. The curse turned into a fierce blood color flowing on the blade from top to bottom, dripping and spreading, and finally dissipating in the air. Scarlet marks were left behind. It's a success. Huai Shi waved the ferocious iron in his hand and smiled happily. But when he looked back, he saw that his students were retreating in horror. Only the old Ping Shi raised his head and stood in place excitedly, staring at the evil spirit in his eyes. That's right, it was the ferocious ghost walking in the human world. It was unaware of how terrible it was at the moment, and even smiled. It walked forward in the bloody shroud, holding a sharp blade that slaughtered lives. It was just like the legendary king of the great rivers and mountains strolling on the road of the capital of peace, killing and destroying everything. Stepping on the corpses, it brought despair. That would be too wonderful. Name. His lips trembled with excitement, and he couldn't wait to step forward, wanting to know, does it have a name? Mr. Huai Shi. Huai Shi froze for a moment and looked down at the weapon in his hand. Name? On the blade, there were vague and ancient characters appearing. It was the blessing left by the former forgers. In the world, only Huai Shi could understand the language. If it was described in the language of the present, there were only 4 words. Birth, old age, illness, death. This was the essence born from endless despair. Resentment. Next to him, a familiar voice sounded, let's call it resentment. Dead silence came in an instant. A strange figure appeared beside Huai Shi, took the odachi from his hand, waved it twice, and nodded happily. For a novice, this is a rare and excellent result. Well done, Huai Shi. Yuan's eyes widened, stunned and in disbelief. Who was that woman? Why did she seem to be very familiar with her teacher? They even put their arms around each other's shoulders. And she wanted to be close to Huai Shi. She subconsciously reached out to touch her waist, but found that she didn't bring Yamagata with her when she went out. Even Huai Shi was stunned, looking at Tongi in front of him. He didn't know why she suddenly appeared in front of others. But when she looked over with a smile, he felt helpless. Well, she probably came out to play when she was in the mood. Then, Tongi raised her hand and snapped her fingers. Time seemed to freeze in an instant. She pressed the pause button. She turned around and looked at Huai Shi mischievously. What's wrong? You look like you saw a ghost? No, I'm just not used to you appearing outside. Huai Shi shook his head and looked around. Is it okay? What if it is? Tongi leaned closer and looked into his eyes. It may be very troublesome if the news is leaked. Will you help me kill her? You're daydreaming. Huai Shi rolled his eyes. You're hopeless. Just wait for death. Goodbye. All right, let's stop joking around. As your contractor, this is the first time you've created such an excellent product, so I have to share it with you. Toheim lowered her head as she fiddled with the odachi, Grudge, which was a head taller than her. She commented excitedly, I can give you full marks for the usage of the alchemy fire and the confinement hand, but the forger's furnace isn't something that's easy to use. If there's a slight mistake, it can be considered inexperience, but it can be made up for. The final result, without a doubt, is a top grade. She looked up and looked at the man in front of her with a gratified smile. Congratulations, Huai Shi, you are already an excellent alchemist. It's still far from that. Huai Shi shook his head. You said it yourself, it's resentment, right? It's not despair. Although the result was still excellent, it was still a little short of perfection. It couldn't be restrained from radiating resentment into restrained despair. It was a loss of purity. This point can be made up for in the future. The forger's skill is better than the alchemist's in that it can continuously improve on the work. It's not like the alchemist's, where the final result is determined the moment it comes out of the furnace. Tangi sighed. Also, don't make a mistake about who you're comparing to, why sure. Whether it's the Ivory Tower, the Iron Crystal Throne, or the Stoneforge Society, the alchemists you've seen are all geniuses among geniuses. They are 1 in a million, and there are even alchemists who are unattainable. It's not wrong to have high standards, but if your eyes are always looking up, living will be very tiring. You didn't go through a lot of practice and tempering since you were young, and you don't have the enormous amount of effort they poured into pursuing miracles. To be able to stand side by side with them with your mediocre talent in alchemy is already enough to show how precious your results are. As she spoke, the odachi in Tangi's hand once again scattered into countless feathers and disappeared into the air. Huaisher felt another fierce origin substance equipment appear in his soul. Huaisher was stunned, and he couldn't help but frown. How is it? You should have noticed it by now, right? Tangi asked. Huaisher nodded. It wasn't just the odachi. Almost all of the weapons, including the rage axe, still had the energy to go one step further. What shocked him was that he had originally thought that the virtuous sword would have the highest degree of completion among all of the origin substance equipment. But now it seemed that it was the rope of sorrow? Not only that, but in terms of degree of completeness, the rope of sorrow was just a step away from completely becoming a physical relic. Even after Huaisher died, it would still be able to continue existing. It was hard to understand, but it was indeed different from the other weapons. Huaisher finally remembered the spoils of war he had obtained in Yamatai City. When he had accepted Kitten's request to kill the other princes, it had been given to him as an advance payment. It was a chain that had fused with the rope of sorrow. Chapter 607. What the hell is this? Huaisher raised his hand, and the heavy chain emerged from the void. It was shrouded in sparks and black smoke, and its outline appeared. It had already completely merged with his source equipment, and there was no distinction between them. Just this one item made the completion of the sorrowful rope far ahead of other weapons. Even the tachi of resentment that Huaisher had created using the creator's memories could not catch up. It was because of this that Huaisher was extremely surprised. An invitation from Helios, Tangi said. It's the starting point of the alchemist's pilgrimage. Basically, every alchemist should have heard of its existence and have some fear and longing for it. Even a great grandmaster can do it? Even a great grandmaster grew up step by step from an apprentice, right? Tangi thought for a moment and said, As far as I know, Mikhail did not accept Helios' invitation, but another great grandmaster of the Stone Cauldron Society, Garland, did go. Anyway, the chain you got from Kitten is a mission item. Once triggered, it will generate a legendary mission called Helios's Wish. Huaisher's expression twitched. Kitten, that bastard. All the mission rewards given were F*King props from other missions. Thinking about it carefully, whether it was the identity card, the Nibelungen, or the chain, none of them were freaking easy. At that time, he was so happy that he thought he had taken advantage of it, but he did not expect that this bastard had sold him out. Fortunately, he had taken back the title of prince, so it was not too much of a loss. But no matter what, he would have to settle this account with Kitten in the future. After scratching his head, Huaisher let out a long breath and calmed down. So, Helios' invitation is a chain? To be precise, it is a puzzle that is casually scattered across the entire realm, casually squandering miracles like rain. The invitation itself is a perfect relic carrier, an empty shell. After saying that, Tangi smiled. Before that, let's talk about Helios. Helios Workshop, Helios War Chariot. Do you know anything about them? One of the legendary top 10 workshops. Huaisher scratched his head and said, It's even one of the top few workshops, but not many people know about it. That's why you're still too biased in this subject. This should be common knowledge for alchemists. Well then, let's start from the beginning. Tangi leaned back and sat on the invisible sofa and chair as if she had fallen to the ground. She put on a comfortable posture and began to speak, ignoring the fact that Sure was still standing there in a daze. And Sure was not to be outdone. He sneered, sat back in the air, and leaned back on the invisible chair. He even crossed his legs, leaned back comfortably, and crossed his arms. Even Tangi froze in place, stunned. How did you do it? Horse stance. After a long time, Sure squeezed out a few words from between his teeth, and looked away awkwardly. His face was already red. Pft, ha 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 ha. Tangi was already laughing unceremoniously. She was almost wiping her tears. She leaned forward and back and was overjoyed. Forget it, forget it. You'd better sit here. This is the first time someone has done the horse stance in front of me. I can't go on at all. As she spoke, she pointed to the empty air beside her. Sure propped himself up with one leg and finally breathed a sigh of relief. Then he looked at the air beside Tangi, and reached out to touch it. He vaguely felt the touch of a sofa. He pressed twice, and it was indeed a sofa. What's the principle behind this? Invisible things and visible things. It's just a little alchemy trick. Don't look at it. You won't be able to learn it. Tangi rested her chin on her elbow and smiled. Sure thought for a while and sat down tentatively. He sat firmly, right beside her. Then he felt a little stiff. Aren't you going to sit closer? Tangi looked at him and asked curiously, You're almost sitting outside, right? Nonsense. Sure sat upright and looked straight ahead. Are you still going to speak? He shouldn't have sat here. It felt more tiring than the horse stance. Okay. Where were we just now? So you're just teasing me, right? Sure reminded her unhappily, Helios. Yes, Helios. As if ignoring what happened, Tangi leaned on the armrest that only she enjoyed and said lazily, It's indeed one of the top 10 workshops, but in essence, it doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't even have any resident alchemists. It's a miracle that can put itself above countless alchemists, a relic that once belonged to the authority of Olympus. Some may think that it's the chariot of Helios, the sun god, but in fact, it's Helios himself. Do you understand? Sure looked at her blankly and quickly looked away. What do you mean? It means that Helios, the god, doesn't exist at all. It's the legendary sun chariot of Apollo. It's the carrier of the sun that was once cast by the Olympian gods. It once represented the authority of the sun, the miracle of Olympus. Is this clear enough? Sure was stunned for a long time and finally reacted. Yes, that's why it could continue to exist after the fall of the god. From its nature, you can think of it as a cosmic space station that operates in the orbit of the solar system, flying in the cold universe. Every 71 years, it will cross the orbit of Earth, allowing alchemists to visit it. Although this huge scale of space is meaningless, it does imitate the movement of the sun and thus obtains a huge amount of power. It's not an exaggeration to call it the incarnation of the sun. It's a war weapon created by the Olympian gods to deal with the danger of hell. It's said that a superweapon that can destroy a continental plate with one hit. Isn't it awesome? It doesn't sound real. Would the Astronomical Society allow such a thing to exist? Of course not, but long before the Astronomical Society was established, no, long before the fall of the Astronomical Society, it was damaged by a passing bad thing. So, foreigners are not good people. No matter how enthusiastic they are, there should be a limit. If those guys had been a little vigilant, it wouldn't have ended up like this. Sure did not understand the second half of the sentence at all, but it was not the first time that Tangi talked to herself like this. He just treated it as the dark history of Olympus. In other words, Helios is currently in a damaged state? Almost 90% of its functions are gone. Tangi shrugged. So, Helios' remaining instinct chose to repair itself. But unfortunately, Hephaestus no longer exists, so it can only be done by others. That's why there are invitations. Through its own orbit, every time it gets close to the Sun, it produces a large number of semi-finished products in batches, and then throws them to the present and hell to generate a large number of invitations. Any alchemist who wants to set foot on Helios can modify the invitation and record the miracle of their smelting in the blank relic. It's like continuing your own creation on a half-completed painting. As long as you can achieve a perfect rating, you will be regarded as a guest worthy of being invited by Helios and get the qualification to go on Helios. And then you have to undertake the maintenance work, Tanguy said with a calm face. They are looking for someone to repair the sewer pipe. Do you think they will invite you for tea? But for any alchemist, being able to come into contact with the creation of the gods is already a great opportunity, not to mention being able to participate in it. If you can finish the work within a month of the intersection of the tracks, then you can get off the train with a thank you gift. If you can't, then you have to finish your part. But once the train stops, it's not easy to get off, do you understand? Huai swallowed his saliva. Think about it, an alchemist was carried by a cold chariot, sailing in the cold universe, separated from everything by the vast darkness and despair. And the present, far away on the scale of astronomy, waiting for the next meeting after 70 years. If you ask me, some alchemists can't wait to stay a little longer. Tanguy shrugged. They don't want to get off the train when they arrive at the station, so they deliberately stay there. Over time, because of the research on Helios, a group has formed inside, which is what we call the Helios Workshop. But the only one who can really represent the Helios Workshop is Helios itself. Then, after so many years, is there any progress in the maintenance? About 30%? Tanguy said indifferently. The material is rare. Sometimes, Helios' own projections are like taxis working everywhere in hell, so it's not surprising to meet them. The moment you put it that way, it really lowers my status. Anyway, this is your chance. Tanguy's words made Huai heart skip a beat. You've received their gifts for so long, I'm afraid you're already on the list, right? I have to go up and fix the water pipes. Huai's eyes widened. What are you afraid of? With the skills of the forger, you won't have to worry about not being able to fix it when the tracks of Helios converge a year later. Tanguy glanced at him. Besides, there's still a year. A year later, you might be at grade 5. Don't say that advancing to grade 5 is as easy as eating and drinking, okay? I'm only at grade 3. Huai's eyes widened. Moreover, you forced me to advance by 1 grade, so I need more experience than others for no reason. Don't worry, as long as De Kun has a breakthrough, young Arbiter Ming's destiny will grow very quickly. As for Great Arbiter Ming, you've killed countless people in hell and exterminated an entire hell. How many correction points did you get? As long as you use the secret method to convert it, you'll be able to skip the early and middle stages and directly jump to the late stages. When the materials for advancement are more or less prepared, you can consider advancing to grade 4. Tanguy counted with her fingers and patted Huai's shoulder proudly. Look at how meticulous your sister's plans are. Yeah, you're really meticulous. From the beginning to the end, you've arranged everything clearly. Huai rolled his eyes. Tanguy leaned closer and smiled. Are you angry? Huai looked away and leaned back. I'll fall if I move any further. I'll get into a horse stance. Huai held his breath angrily and squeezed out the words from between his teeth. Tanguy's laughter became even more joyful. All right, it's almost time. I'll go back first. She reached out and pulled Huai up from the ground. You're already a teacher, don't be so childish. Huai sighed and waved his hand, indicating for her to leave quickly. But Tanguy stayed where she was and looked at him. Suddenly, she said, there's one more thing that I haven't told you, Huai was puzzled. She reached out her hand and ruffled Huai's hair with lightning speed before he could react. Her smile was bright and dazzling. You've grown, Huai, she said. Congratulations. Huai was stunned. Then goodbye. She winked at the contractor in front of her and turned to leave. Her figure disappeared into the air. Soon, the frozen time resumed its flow. It was as if everyone had forgotten about the illusion that disappeared, and did not notice that they had lost 10 minutes. They only saw Huai Shi standing where he was thoughtfully and looking in another direction. He was silent and did not speak. Teacher. Lin Shurjiu looked at Huai Shi in confusion and reminded him softly, Are you okay? Ah, sorry, I was stunned for a moment. Huai Shi came back to his senses and smiled at them. I remembered something happy. In the silence, Yuan looked at that smile and felt sad for no reason. Du was still standing quietly in the corner. His stooped body was stiff and he was already sweating. He did not know what had happened at all, but he felt a stinging pain in his eyes. It was as if for a moment, the tyrannical sun had descended here and coldly ravaged the pair of eyes that had seen too many miracles. It left a deep burn mark in his eyes like the sun. It did not even give him a reason to be afraid. It just indifferently gave him a punishment. Tell him. You should bow down. Chapter 608. All in all, Huai Shi was in a very good mood now. Although he didn't admit that he was very happy to be praised by his big sister, in any case, getting a new weapon was something worth celebrating. However, the weapon didn't feel real just by holding it in his hand. Therefore, of course, he had to find someone to test it on. Then, there was a problem. Huai Shi wasn't crazy enough to find students in the school in the middle of the night to randomly kill. The records in the Book of Destiny were enough for practice, but it didn't give Huai Shi too much pressure. Therefore, he could only find someone from the people around him. Yuan? He looked at the girl in the gray skirt behind him, who was unhappy for some reason, and immediately felt a pain in his conscience. Huai Shi, what are you thinking? That's your student, then. Lin Shurjiu? Therefore, the little hut in the forest inexplicably trembled under the teacher's loving gaze and squeezed out a smile with difficulty. Huai Shi also squeezed out a smile. Then he sighed. Forget it. She looked pitiful and couldn't fight very well. Bullying little Shurjiu didn't have any sense of existence. Then, there was only one choice among the acquaintances in the school. He took out his phone, opened the address book, and then dialed a number. Hello? He smiled and asked, Is Raymond there? Buzai, see, before the flail with a strange accent could speak halfway, it was snatched by Raymond. Hello? What's the matter? I just remembered that you were discharged from the hospital. Huai Shi lowered his head and smiled at the bloody long knife in his hand. I arranged a rehabilitation exercise for you. Awesome. Half an hour later, Raymond, who was taken to the overhead classroom, was still holding a hamburger in his hand. He looked at Huai Shi, who had already begun to warm up, and was stunned. I saw you ready to hit me as soon as I came in, he asked in surprise. You call this rehabilitation exercise? It's just exercise, Huai Shi said with a smile. Isn't it because I'm afraid that you'll get sick from boredom? Besides, with your skills, you shouldn't be afraid of this, right? I'm just a driver. Don't spout nonsense. He looked at Lin Shurjiu and Yuan and said, Hey, are you going to use me to teach the students? I'm warning you, I will complain. How long had it been since Jacob had been dragged to the guillotine? Do you still have a conscience? He's still watching you from the capital. Sorry, I didn't want to do that, but he's just too weak. Huai Shi said, Don't worry, I'm just trying out my new weapon. I can't bully a student, right? Is it okay to bully me? You borrowed money from me last time and then bet on my business. Are you going to consider sharing some with me? Sorry, the wind was too loud. I didn't hear you clearly, Raymond replied with a serious face. He raised his hand and patted his shoulder. Isn't it just a sparring partner? Come, ravage me mercilessly. He finished his hamburger in a few bites, then took off his leather jacket and threw it to Lin Shurjiu. Then, he entered the venue in a singlet. Muscles. When the leather jacket was taken off, anyone would notice Raymond's muscles. They weren't exaggerated. In fact, they weren't very developed. However, the division and combination of the muscles, the scars on them, and the flexibility and ease of control were enough to make one feel a sense of valiance. Between his 5 fingers, the muscles in his palms jumped flexibly. As his body warmed up, the muscles all over his body rippled like water. Heat was rising, because his body temperature was rising. This was different from the drummer's and use steps origin substance application technique. In a literal sense, it increased the body's heat and increased the supply from the source, thereby exploding with a powerful force. Elder Luo's explanation was very thorough. There were only so many techniques in the world. The basic techniques were the straight punch, the jab, the kick, and so on. No matter how strange the techniques developed from this foundation, in the end, they all came from the same source. For example, the performance technique itself was through the changes in rhythm and weapons, reinterpreting the music. However, it was still built on the combination of the drummer and use step. For example, the heretic king, who was so strong that he was unreasonable, all he needed was a serious punch to break through a city. No matter how many changes there were, it still remained the same. The drummer and use steps focused on the use of muscles. Thus, after combining them, one could freely control the muscles all over the body and enter a state beyond the limit. The technique that Redmond was displaying was to increase the supply of heat to his body. Through the strengthening of his body, he was able to vent out the heat from his body. One was to increase the efficiency of the utilization, and the other was to increase the upper limit of the output. Of course, both sides took care of each other, but the main point was still different. If one wanted to have both, then they were destined to fail. Making a choice was the wisest method for an ascender at this stage. Raymond's warm-up posture and movements had already exceeded Huaishi's expectations, raising him to the level of a powerful enemy. There was even a faint shadow of a certain person. The existence on the Ivy League flagship that gave Huaishi immense pressure. The level 4 Azura Everly. "You're really close to the Eye of Nightmares," Huaishi exclaimed. "Not at all. It's just some basic skills that can be seen everywhere. Don't worry about it." Raymond waved his hand with a smile. "Shouldn't we announce the rules first? If you pull out that pistol, I'll immediately lie on the ground and surrender, then write a report letter." "Don't worry. Beelzebub probably doesn't have time now." Huaishir looked up and glanced at the Lord of the Flies, who was happily talking to Lien Shackle outside the arena. He could not help but shake his head. "Can we fight with weapons without using stigmata and soul power? Isn't that still bullying? How many weapons do you have? Besides, what's that move called? Whether it's Cord or Xiong Dragon, it's not something you can take out, right?" "Don't worry. Just one today." Huaishir opened the burial sanctuary with a smile. In the overwhelming crow tide, a blood-colored crow feather tachi slowly grew out. It was a terrifyingly long sword, hatred. Thus, under the blood-colored shroud, the ferocious ghost god reappeared. "It's useless to say more," he said. "Let's begin." Raymond was dumbfounded. He did not understand why Huaishir suddenly changed his style and became a ferocious solidifier. He pointed to Huaishir's side in disbelief. "Wait, it's fine if you hit me, but why did you call Andrea to watch?" Huaishir frowned and wanted to turn around. But there was no one behind him. It was at that moment that a loud sound burst out. It was like a burning chariot advancing in an instant. The earth shook, and Raymond was already close. The heavy halberd pulled out from the empty classroom slashed down, and pure enormous power operated in it. His movements were unbelievably fast. At this moment, he was the incarnation of the chariot of fate. The halberd roared. It pierced through Huaishir's chest, tore the bones, and dug out a big hideous hole. Killed in one blow. The first round was over. Huaishir lowered his head in a daze, looked at the gap in his chest, and then looked at the middle-aged muscular man in front of him. Wow, you're so despicable in a spar? Going all out is respecting the opponent. Raymond pulled out the halberd, slowly retreated 20 steps away, and hooked his finger at Huaishur. Come on, hero. Isn't this a rehabilitation exercise? You have to do something exciting, right? That's what you said. Huaishur sighed and twisted his neck. A cracking sound was heard as the joints rubbed against each other. Then, he suddenly disappeared on the spot. It was not that Huaishur had disappeared. It was that he was too fast. Raymond was engulfed by a chill. He subconsciously wanted to retreat, but the hideous smile bathed in blood was already close at hand. Raven feather Tachi, hatred swept across. In a flash, Huaishur appeared behind Raymond. The blood on the blade dripped and dissipated in the air. The second round was over. A red line suddenly appeared on Raymond's neck. Then, it broke cleanly and fell to the ground, still blinking blankly. It was hard to understand. The severed head's lips were still moving. Why are you so fast? Huaishur lowered his head and looked at his broken trousers and his swollen calf. He looked back at him and showed the same gentle smile as Luo Xian. This skill is very simple, he said. Just do it when the air is not paying attention. What the hell? Raymond opened his eyes wide. He even forgot to pick up his head from the ground. He finally felt the same sense of sluggishness as Huaishur. Are you stupid, stinky brother? This was the Orchard School's secret technique. Taking advantage when XX is not paying attention. In fact, it was just the 5 steps of you that surpassed Huaishur's limit. In the end, he didn't even touch the edge of Senior Sister. His kneecaps were already broken. If it weren't for the empty classroom, he would probably have to go back and rest for a long time. But this would also lose the meaning of sparring, right? The empty classroom restarted. Huaishur returned to the original place, stretched his body, and entered the state of exceeding the limit again. He hooked his finger at Raymond. Again! In silence, Raymond touched his neck, took a deep breath, held up the heavy halberd again, and assumed a charging posture. A short sword quietly appeared at his waist. He began to get serious. The ground cracked again. The chariot started and rumbled forward. The hurricane came with the halberd. The strong wind had already stung Huaishur's face from a distance. The Tachi swept and slashed. Then there was a burst of thunder. Ha! Raymond's flushed face suddenly opened, and he let out a roar like a lion. It was as if there was a physical wave of air mixed with the fluctuations of origin substance. It shook one's consciousness, forming a frightening aura comparable to that of thunder. If it were a normal person, their origin substance would have been destroyed by this roar, and they would have been turned into a vegetable. Huaishur's movements, however, only paused for a moment. A moment was more than enough. The halberd instantly shattered the Tachi's sweep. Raymond closed in, and he let go of the halberd. His left hand pulled out a short sword from his waist, and in this moment of crisis, stabbed towards Huaishur's heart. Bang! The sharp sound of metal scraping against metal could be heard. Sparks flew. This is Raymond's pupils dilated. The Tachi in Huaishur's hand, which was originally incomparably long, had shrunk to the size of a wakizashi. He raised it from his hand, blocking the incoming dagger. Immediately afterwards, Huaishur raised his right hand, and his 5 fingers clenched tightly. The heavenly drum sounded. Raymond's body slid backwards, and the imprint of a fist appeared on his raised arm. I forgot to tell you. Huaishur smiled slightly. The length can be adjusted, and by the way, amidst the sharp sound of growing iron crystals, the blood-colored katana in his hand suddenly extended forward. After crossing a long distance, it pierced straight through Raymond's chest and came out from his back. Then, Huaishur's voice followed closely behind. Its maximum length is 39.9 meters. Chapter 609. Imperial Divine Blade, Hatred. The weight of 3 strokes, 5 caddies, 1 tail, 6 centimeters, remained constant. Normally, the blade was 6 feet long, but according to the user's will, it could freely extend and contract between 4 inches and 119 feet, 3 inches and 1 minute. It was truly a must-have item for traveling, killing people, and gifting to friends and family. Those who received it were usually moved to the point of tears. Just like right now. Raymond was already shedding tears of grief and indignation. After piercing through his opponent's body like a bolt of lightning, it quickly retracted and returned to Huai Shi's hand, returning to the length of a normal blade. It was the most suitable size for Huai Shi to use. As expected, this was the best. Unfortunately, the blade didn't manage to pierce through Su Chen's heart. Su Chen's hidden trump card had been seen through at the last moment. It had probably pierced through his lungs, but his organs hadn't been damaged. To an ascended cultivator, this wasn't a big deal. Unfortunately, Raymond was somewhat flustered as he covered his wound, missing the opportunity to counterattack. He quickly realized that this was a virtual classroom, so he didn't have to worry about the curse in his body leaking out. He shook his head self-mockingly and sighed in relief. His eyes, however, were filled with tears. He couldn't help it. This was because the pain he felt wasn't from the blade's wound, but rather from the infection caused by the poisonous origin substance in his chest. It wasn't the hatred within Huai Shi's origin substance, but rather some sort of natural reaction. It was some sort of pain left over from the past. He had been a motherless child since he was young, wandering the borders, risking his life for so many years without any good results. In order to save his partner, he had even become a traitor. He didn't have much time left and was about to die, but he still had a large loan that he couldn't repay. He had no choice but to stay in the ivory tower as a tool. He had finally managed to ask for leave to travel, but when he returned, he was cut down. This kind of life was so shameful, so empty, and so meaningless. Birth, old age, sickness, and death. Living was just too painful. He wanted to die. He wanted to involuntarily throw himself in front of that blade and let it end his life, just like he had done to the samurai, bringing his last bit of dignity with him as he cut off his head. Everything was over. He wanted to be free. When Raymond finally realized what was going on, he looked at Huai Shi with tears in his eyes, which were full of shock and fear. "Where did you get such an evil thing?" Huai Shi looked down at the knife in his hand and thought for a moment. "Someone gave it to you. Do you like it?" "I like it." He loved it to death. She loved him so much that she wanted to die. "How dare you force a middle-aged man to recall his dark past?" Raymond raised his hand and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, ignoring the tears in his eyes. "How dare you use such a dirty thing on a lowly social animal? Are you ready to pay the price?" Although the corners of his mouth still carried a trace of his usual frivolous smile, his eyes had become tranquil. It was as silent as iron. Without a doubt, he became serious. Huai Shi thought for a moment and said seriously, "If I have offended you in any way, I can apologize." "No need, because you will regret it very soon." Enveloped by the heat, Raymond, who had been burned red, grinned. His blood turned into mist and rose into the air. In an instant, he was within reach. Iron light and hurricane swept across. A roar burst forth. It was as if an angry heavy truck had crashed head-on with a hurricane, crushing the walls, obstacles, and everything else that was not worth mentioning. Huai Shi slid back more than 10 meters. The resentment in his hand kept shaking. The web between his thumb and index finger holding the knife cracked, and wisps of blood seeped out. But it was not over. Raymond's movements did not stop at all. He had already pounced on him again. The halberd was straight and stabbed forward. Huai Shi's leaned-back body lowered unbelievably. Then, as if his muscles were contracting, he rubbed against the halberd like a spring full of power and pounced forward. You step, a flat stab. He was entangled. The iron ball covered with barbs was thrown out with iron chains and wrapped around the blade of Huai Shi's sword. It pulled violently, and the instantaneous burst of power caused the blade to deviate. Raymond held the halberd with one hand and took out a flail with the other hand, locking the counterattack sword. At a very close distance, he smiled at Huaishur. "I'll show you the skills of the wild dog of war." As he spoke, he raised his head and smashed forward like a hammer, hitting Huaishur's head, causing his vision to turn black, and he lost his vision for a moment. But the resentment had already broken free from its restraints and shattered the iron chains. In this darkness where nothing could be seen, it broke the halberd in Raymond's hand by relying on the sound of the wind. The heavy weapon split into two from the middle. But when Huaishur opened his eyes, Raymond had already pulled out a brand new weapon from the empty classroom. It was so familiar in shape. It was the Teuton greatsword that was exactly the same as Avery's. With the heavy sword in hand, Raymond's aura became more and more violent. In the state of blood ignition, he raised the sword high and slashed down at Huaishur's head. Justice descends from the heavens. Steel intersected in the air and rubbed against each other. Sparks burst out and illuminated the eyes of the two. The hurricane whistled past. Then, everything returned to silence. It came to an abrupt end. Huaishur's right arm, which had been cut off by the heavy sword, fell to the ground, but his head wasn't chopped off as expected. Instead, the blade that pierced through Raymond's head was still between blood and bone. In the third round, the outcome was decided. The empty classroom was reset. But the thrilling moment just now still lingered in Huaishur's body and hadn't dissipated. He had underestimated the threat of Raymond's explosive state and had almost been killed by a series of consecutive moves. Although his speed and strength had increased qualitatively in the explosive state of blood ignition, that set of well-tempered attacks was flawless. He was in a stable and invincible position. In the worst-case scenario, they would just perish together. If it wasn't for the fact that the blade could retract freely, he wouldn't be able to make it in time even if he exceeded the limit. In a daze, he almost thought that the person standing in front of him was that old man, Avery, who had walked out of a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. With the reset, Raymond appeared 20 steps away again. He twisted his neck happily and sighed softly. "Aya, it's been a long time since I've had such a good fight. It's rare for me to be in such a good mood. Do you mind if I increase the difficulty for you?" "Please." Huaishur nodded. Thus, Raymond's hand swiped through the preset list of the empty classroom. Not long after, a full set of heavy armor, including his face, was included. There were still traces of swords and sabers on the heavy armor. The overlapping blood color dyed it black and red. There was a round shield fixed on the right arm, but the Eye of Nightmare emblem on it had been hung off with a sharp blade. What was left was only the faint outline of the dragon-descendant knight. On the majestic lion helmet, 2 blazing breaths slowly exhaled. A pair of dark green eyes opened, carrying a smile and malevolence. How I miss the feeling of being young. There was no doubt that after returning to his peak and removing the influence of the curse, his body was as light as a dream. "Come, let's start the class, Teacher Huaishur." He twisted his neck happily and hooked his finger at the enemy in front of him. "The students are still watching. Don't hesitate for too long. Are you so cooperative?" Huaishur's resentment shook off the remaining blood on the blade. After pondering for a moment, he finally raised his head and smiled. "Then, let's talk about armor break in this lesson." The limit was activated. Amidst the rumbling, the blade of resentment, which had increased in size, whizzed over. An hour later, the sound of violent collisions in the empty classroom finally came to an abrupt end. When the empty scene dissipated, both of them were covered in sweat. It was a hearty spar and duel. But towards the end, even if they weren't afraid of death in the empty simulation, there wasn't much to gain from fighting. Thanks to Raymond's cooperation, Huaishur already knew the effects and various parameters of the Royal Divine Blade, Resentment. As for the following cooperation between the young arbiter of life's stigmata and resentment, as well as the hidden changes, Raymond didn't want to be a target anymore. Every time he was hit, he would be forced to recall his own dark history. The shame and helplessness of wanting to die was unbearable. For the enemy, the effect of this blade was too despicable. Young people who hadn't experienced much might be less affected, but the more experienced they were, the harder it was for them to resist the helplessness and pain of life and death, and pray for relief. After being hit, what they felt wasn't resentment, but a desire for death. If Raymond's feeling wasn't wrong, that blade should still have the effect of swallowing origin substance, but in essence it was targeting his stigmata. It was just that the stigmata data in the empty classroom was fixed and couldn't affect it. That saber was alive. He could conclude that there was absolutely no mistake about this. Huai sure didn't deny this. When he waved his hand and dispersed resentment, the blade once again disintegrated into countless steel feathers and returned to the sacred burial ground. After being forged and smelted, the despair that had condensed into steel had been given to the entire flock of crows. At the same time, resentment had become the incarnation of the flock of crows. The casting of the same origin made this fusion so easy. Now, the fierce blade was the sharp claws of the flock of crows. In accordance with their instinctive desire for evolution, they were endowed with insatiable hunger and greed, and even dared to feed on disasters and miracles. This was the gift that the Sun Maker had left for Huai Shi. As long as he accepted the Sun Maker's inheritance, there would be a grand path in front of him. The only problem was, Huai Shi scratched his head, feeling at a loss. Where the hell was he going to find so many ascenders and consolidators for them to eat? Chapter 610. These days, it was getting harder and harder to raise crow. Huai Shi actually started to reminisce about the past like an old man. Thinking about how simple it was before he evolved, he just had to show them a couple of paragraphs from his Book of Destiny every now and then. They would be very satisfied with that. But now? Even small tomes couldn't satisfy them anymore. They wanted other people's lives. As for the one that liked to turn into a human and play with him recently, it wanted his life. Every time he saw a long list of deductions, Huai Shi's heart would ache. If this continued, he suspected that he wouldn't be able to live for long. No matter how big his family business was, it couldn't be ruined like this. Huai Shi didn't feel sad for long, because in the cage of dreams, the crow that hadn't eaten the origin substance or the stigmata for a long time had already begun to shout at the top of their lungs again. They wanted a reward. They wanted to watch a short movie from the Book of Destiny twice a day. That's all I can do. Huai Shi flipped through the Book of Destiny for a long time and found a page to send in. In the end, the instinctive praises of the Book of Destiny were strange thoughts like, "That's it, so short, one more time," and so on. He didn't know where it had learned this from. He didn't know why, but he felt like a has-been idol being despised by his fans. Life was hard. He sighed and looked away. "Let's go. It's time to eat," he said to Raymond. "It's rare for you to be so cooperative. I'll treat you. Little Yuan and 19 should come too." Raymond, who was about to go back and eat instant noodles, had his eyes light up. He leaned over and asked in a low voice, "I heard that you're a VIP at Kuei Lu. You're also a VIP at a few restaurants with hell ratings. The kind where you eat for free?" Huai Shi couldn't help but roll his eyes. "What are you thinking? They're giving you face. Are you really going to go empty-handed? I'll personally cook soup for you. Do you dare to drink it? As long as it's not a rat, I'm fine with it." Raymond clicked his tongue and sighed. "Don't try to fool me with an ordinary restaurant. I've lost dozens of pounds of blood today, and more than 10 heads have been broken. You're giving me this? All right, come to my house today." Huai Shi rolled his eyes. "Remember to eat less. Don't let Feng Shu cook too much." When he heard Raymond mention rats, he thought of the group of park guards that were brought back by the good brother from the legal department. Although it was just a shell, after gaining experience, Kitten would be able to replicate it again. It wouldn't be long before the park's debt collection army would start mass-producing. What a sin. Just as he was shaking his head and sighing, he saw a lonely figure walking out of the school office building. He wore a cyan ingzhou robe, a braid that did not belong to the era, and a beard that seemed to have experienced the vicissitudes of life. He also had a saber that never left his waist. Sasaki-kun? His footsteps paused for a moment, and he asked with some concern, "Are you okay?" Sasaki Kayomasa, the external teacher of the Ingzhou Flower Path classroom, used to be the swordsmanship instructor of the Ingzhou Chinese clan, and fought with Huaishir because of rumors. But he was basically a tough guy without any scheming. It was hard to imagine that he would be so sad. Did something happen in the Flower Path classroom? After a moment of silence, Sasaki showed a relaxed smile. Huaishir-kun, I'm no longer working in the Flower Path classroom. The next teacher will be the disciple of the Yamanaka professor. Ningzi is a good kid. Please take care of me in the future, Huaishir-kun. Huaishir was stunned. And Sasaki was about to say something, but he was interrupted by Huaishir. It's time for dinner. Do you want to eat together? He pointed to the person behind him. If you don't mind, let's eat together. I still have half a bottle of good wine from Tengu Mountain at home. Sasaki was stunned and couldn't help but swallow. He wanted to refuse. But the good wine of Tengu Mountain was too fragrant. Then I'll accept it. The so-called friendship between men was just that. Although Sasaki and Raymond weren't familiar with each other before, they had 2 meals together, drank a glass of wine, and chatted. Boers and Boers always had a common language. One talked about racing, and the other talked about Flower Path. After getting drunk, who cared about that? The way they put their arms around each other's shoulders was so intimate that it was as if they were wearing the same pant. At least until they sobered up, they were still sworn brothers. Brother Raymond, you really don't remember anything? At the banquet that lasted from dinner to supper, Sasaki took off the robe that was in the way and nibbled on edamame as he asked curiously, "Don't you have any memory of what happened before you left the present realm?" "Oh, if you want to talk about it, there is a little." Raymond scratched his head and thought for a long time. "I only remember that I seemed to be from the Russian Federation. No, I think I'm from Rome. Forget it, I can't remember at all. That's the same as not having any memories." Sasaki slammed the table. "If you ask me, you must be from Ingzhou. When you drink, you have the momentum of a sword master. There are no people with green eyes and yellow hair in Ingzhou." Raymond was confused for a long time. "Besides, I don't remember what the present realm looks like at all. Occasionally, I've only watched some movies, but I don't know much about it. After coming to the Ivory Tower, I've been running around the border. Not to mention Ingzhou, I haven't even been to Asia. Didn't you just say that you went on a trip?" "Yes, I went to Shambhala and had physical therapy there for a few days," Raymond said, and took out his mobile phone to show them. "Huaishir, the scenery of the places you recommended to me is really good." Huaishir looked at him and couldn't help but sigh. "It's really good. I've always wanted to go there once. I have a friend there. It's easy to go there. A round trip every 2 days. It's very fast. Next time?" "Forget it." Huaishir sipped his drink and couldn't help but sigh. "It's meaningless to go there. It's really sad to see a friend lying in the ICU. Besides, that guy doesn't want me to go and see him. He always says that it's too embarrassing. Wait, the one in the bed next to you. Wait, isn't this bastard fine?" He stared at him and leaned over. In the photo on Raymond's mobile phone, why did the slut in the hospital bed next to him look so familiar? "Is this your friend?" Raymond was also stunned. He looked at him and said, "Indeed, people like you should be able to get along well. But is there something wrong with your friend's brain?" At the mention of this, Raymond's expression became complicated. As if he recalled some inexplicable horror, he couldn't help but twitch. "Once, I got up in the middle of the night and went to the toilet. I found that he wasn't in his bed. After I came out of the toilet, I found that guy hugging a vending machine and talking. What the hell? A vending machine. Raymond's face turned green when he said this. You didn't see it. That guy was talking to himself. Not only did he hug it, but he also wanted to kiss it. Sasaki was shocked. Wow, such a powerful pervert is rare even in Ingzhou. Mr. Sasaki, I understand your hometown feelings, but please don't compare everything with Ingzhou, okay? Huai Shi's expression had become indescribable. He always felt that something was wrong. Did Mr. Lu's condition get worse during the period of recuperation? He used to think that there was something wrong with his brain, but he didn't expect that there was something wrong with his brain. Should he take some time to see him? However, speaking of which, your friend is really a powerful character. When we first met, he killed people like cutting melons and vegetables. It was completely abnormal. I was almost killed by him. Raymond said with emotion, Fate is really wonderful. You've met before? Huai Shi asked curiously. Raymond opened his mouth and was about to speak, but he was stunned for a long time and incredibly sobered up. He didn't say anything else, but made a zipping gesture at the corner of his mouth. Then, he lifted his hair and showed him the small mole scar behind his ear. That was the Continuing Academy's gag order. Phew, that was close. I almost exploded on the spot. Raymond grabbed the wine bottle and poured it directly. He picked it up and began to drink. Hurry up and calm me down. Huai Shi's mouth twitched, but he didn't feel bad about the wine. He could just go back and bleed a little, and then go to Tengu Mountain to exchange for a few more bottles. Compared to this, he was more concerned about the gag order of the Continuing Academy. The gag order wasn't surprising. Many times, when the Astronomy Association carried out tasks, it would be imposed on the people involved. But the key was the Continuing Academy. There were basically no survivors of things that could alarm the Continuing Academy. Even if there were survivors, they would be taken away to live a carefree life in prison. It was a miracle that they could continue to jump around outside. If he had it, did that mean old Lu also had it? He instinctively felt how deep the water behind this was, but he didn't dare to ask again. If he asked too much about the Continuing Academy, it would be easy to get himself involved. Did you think the silencer's steal was a joke? Everyone wisely acted as if nothing had happened, and everyone continued to drink. When the banquet was about to end, Sasaki pondered for a long time, put down the wine glass, and suddenly got up. He put on his messy clothes, took a few steps back, and bowed. Thank you for taking care of me in the past, he said solemnly. Your kindness to me, Sasaki Kiyomasa, will remember it in my heart. Huai Shi looked at him blankly, unable to understand. What's the matter, Sasaki-san? He asked. Did something happen? Please speak frankly. If I can help, I will not hesitate to help. I'm not here to ask for help. Sasaki shook his head, straightened his body, and finally said what he had always wanted to say. In a few days, I will leave the ivory tower. Recalling the past few years in school, it was like a dream. I can't repay your deep kindness, and I am deeply ashamed. Okay, sit down first and talk slowly. After much persuasion, Huai Shi finally managed to pin him down on the chair and asked for the reason. Speaking of this, the lonely look on Sasaki's face was swept away, and he was full of joy. Half a month ago, at the Ingzhou High officials' meeting, the previous impostor was deposed. He said excitedly. The return of the Rigian family is imminent, and it is said that Miss Hupo has also set off to return to Nara. As a retainer of the Rigian family, how can I stand by at such a critical moment? I must contribute my insignificant strength to the revival of the Rigian family. What? Huai Shi was stunned. The information was too much and he couldn't react. The first thought in his mind was, Hupo's stinky sister is going to be rich. Chapter 6:11. The head of the Lijian family was dismissed from the Ingzhou High Minister meeting, and Li Jian Hupa set off for Ingzhou. Huaishi's mind was in a mess. Each of these three pieces of news was too complicated. It was only November. This year's High Minister meeting within the looming hall was brought forward? The head of the Lijian family was dismissed? Who dismissed him? Who had this qualification? Also, Lijian Hupa set off for Yingzhou. Wasn't Hupa now a non-staff employee of the Social Security Bureau? Why Nara? Shouldn't the fief of the Lijian family be in Anfang country? These three questions, each deeper than the other. He instinctively felt that there was endless calculation. The High Minister meeting was brought forward, indicating that the struggle between the Wu family and the Gong family had further intensified. There were only two people who had this kind of power in the House of the Fallen Inner House, and Hu Po's movements had already indicated that the Social Security Bureau had begun to infiltrate Yingzhou. Huaishi could imagine how happy Xian Niao's old face was. Although it was possible that Hu Po was not stained by the mud and had no private transactions with the Dongxia family, the problem was, who would believe it? As the last son of the Lijian family, one of the direct descendants with the orthodox right of inheritance, from the day he left Dongxia, he was destined to be labeled as a traitor for the rest of his life. Huaishi could imagine what the Lijian family had become today. He didn't know how many people planned to swim naked in the muddy water and compete in fancy ways. They looked at Sasaki in amazement. This guy had been away for so many years, and now he wanted to go back at this juncture. He knew it was a trap, but he still jumped into it stubbornly? Have you really thought it through? He asked seriously. I haven't considered that kind of thing. Sasaki replied calmly. There has never been a need to consider it. From the day I joined the Lijian family, I have been prepared to sacrifice my life one day. As a samurai, there is no better result than this. After a long silence, Huaishi sighed. Don't sacrifice your life for nothing, okay? In my opinion, it's too stupid to sacrifice your life for an empty name. Although it's not appropriate to say this, Mr. Sasaki, the Riken family doesn't need you. The corners of Sasaki's mouth lifted, and he smiled happily. That's not too much, is it? Huaishi rolled her eyes and sighed. She didn't say anything else. She got up and took out another jar from the cabinet and placed it on the table. Although Mount Tiango's sake is finished, Fang Shu's homemade yellow rice wine is enough. Please, Sasaki-kun, this is the last thing I can do for you as a friend. Then, it would be impolite for me to refuse. Sasaki laughed and raised his glass again. Cheers. In the end, he collapsed after a few sips. He was addicted to food. The rest was drunk by Raymond. When he left, he carried the drunk Sasaki in one hand and 2 jars in the other. If Fang Shu hadn't been so happy, Huaishi would have chopped off his hand. In the end, he left a mess for Huaishi. Fang Shu had been busy all night and had been driven to rest by Huaishi. Fortunately, there were still 2 students who could help. 19 cleaned up the table, Yuan mopped the floor, and Huaishi wore an apron to tidy up the kitchen and wash the dishes. He was still full of resentment for Sasaki, who didn't listen to his advice. He murmured while washing. I don't know what he's thinking all day long. He doesn't know the value of life. He's only thinking about why he should treat the whole village to dinner. Little Yuan, 19, don't be such a person when you grow up. The 2 students looked at each other speechlessly. Well, I think you're the one who is least qualified to say such a thing, right? I'm bold because I'm skilled. How can he be compared with me? Huaishi turned back and rolled his eyes at them. With his level, he will be killed on the street sooner or later if he gets involved in this matter in Yingzhou. Isn't it better to live well than anything else? I really hope you can understand the same thing. 19 was bold. Huaishi looked back at him again. He was scared again, but it was too late. If you dare to argue with the teacher, I'll give you a supplementary lesson tomorrow. You can start with the kazoo if you don't know how to play the piano. Lin 19 held the mop and thought for a long time. Suddenly, he said, Great-grandfather told me before that people can't decide how they are born, but they can always decide how they die. I think Mr. Sasaki may not be unaware of the result of his trip this time. He said, he may have been waiting for this day for a long time. Well, for the family, for the glory. Why sure couldn't help but sigh. He finally remembered that his two students, one from the Gen family and the other from the Lin family, were all extraordinary and prestigious families. Both of them were recognized by the Astronomical Society as descendants of the Holy Name. Both of them had a sense of family honor that Huai sure couldn't match since they were young. It was needless to say that they would fight for the family. Huai sure couldn't imagine himself pulling out his sword and shouting, "For the Huai family," and charging into the enemy's line. It was too funny. Not to mention his parents, even his grandfather didn't take the family's reputation seriously when he was still alive. If he died, then so be it. At least he left his grandson an old house. If he sold it in the future, he could eat and drink well for the rest of his life. He asked casually, "Are there many people like him in your family?" Yuan thought for a moment and replied, "There aren't many in the Gen family, and we don't have the habit of inviting guests from outside our family. Great-grandfather always said that the family is a matter for the elders to worry about. As long as the children don't embarrass the family, it's fine. You have to ask 19 about this. He's familiar with it. There's no such thing as glory in the Lin family." Lin 19 scratched his head and said helplessly, "Everyone is thinking about how to commit crimes in hell every day. Many of the elders don't have the surname Lin. Rather than saying that the family's unity comes from blood, it comes more from the Candle Dragon's destiny. It can't be used as a typical example. Well, one was a family that had been passed down for generations, and the other was simply an unorthodox family. Thinking about it this way, it was true that the In family's father was kind and the children were filial. Sensei, you don't have to take things too hard. Many ascendants in Ingzhou, especially the traditional ones, usually have a screw loose in their heads. It's normal for them to seek death all day long." Lin 19 said, "Moreover, Mr. Sasaki is willing to risk his life for the sake of the Riken family. He can already be considered loyal." Loyal, Huai sure thought for a moment and didn't say anything else. He lowered his head and washed the dishes. After cleaning up, Yuan and 19 said goodbye. After saying goodbye to Feng Shu, who was still flipping through books and studying recipes, the two of them set off on their way home. In the night, Yuan suddenly asked, "Is there something you didn't say just now? Aren't you the same?" Lin 19 looked back at her and said, "It's not that Sensei doesn't understand. He's just sad." Yuan didn't say anything. In comparison, I'm the one who really doesn't understand. Lin 19 walked in front, shaking his head and sighing. If Great-grandpa said, 19, hurry up and come over. The Lin family needs you to shed your blood. I might go too, but it would be so embarrassing that I wouldn't be able to bear it. Scared. It's normal to be scared. Not everyone is like your Gen family. Going to the battlefield is like going to the mall. Sparta needs to be taught from a young age. Lin 19 paused for a long time and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Actually, the Lin family is similar, but I'm different. Since young, he had been alone, as if he was in a state of being left alone. No one cared about him. He did whatever he wanted. While everyone else was happily killing and setting fires, he was quietly exuding an annoying aura in a corner. No one cared. Yuan walked calmly at the back and suddenly said, "This may not be bad." Lin 19 was amused. "What's good about it?" Yuan thought for a moment and said seriously, "At least I don't want to kill you." Lin 19 rolled his eyes and didn't say anything. Inexplicably, he thought of the things that happened when he was young. At that time, there was only one television on the mountain. It was placed in front of Grandpa's room. Occasionally, everyone would pay attention to the Dongsha broadcast at night to keep up with the current affairs and learn from the advanced criminal experience of their foreign counterparts. Other than that, no one cared. Only Lin 19 would squat in front of the television at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. As long as the music played, the invincible warrior, the super soldier from space, the hope of mankind, the light energy condor would shine brightly on the stage. He would fight against the space army, the underground empire, Atlantis, and all the little monsters. "Grandpa, I want to be a hero when I grow up." The small house in the woods seemed to have said such a thing. Just when the family meeting asked everyone about their future ambitions, he stood up, posed as if he was shooting light rays, and said loudly, "Just like the light energy condor." He still remembered the dull look on his parents' faces, as well as the stunned faces of his uncles and aunts. It was as if he had said something wrong. Only great-grandpa smiled happily. He reached out and hugged him, encouraging him softly. "Then you have to work hard." It wasn't until a long time later that Lin 19 realized what a stupid thing he had said. No one would remember the bold words of a little kid after watching a cartoon. Even Lin Shurgyo had forgotten about it. Did great-grandpa still remember that kind of small thing? His footsteps suddenly stopped, and he lowered his head bitterly. He suddenly understood why Sasaki Kiyoshi smiled so happily. Perhaps even a wanderer warrior in dire straits would want to be a hero, right? Even if he couldn't become a hero, he would die like a hero. But I'm different. In the silence, he laughed softly. Incomparably self-deprecating. This was a secret that Lin 19 had never spoken out since he was a child. The reason why he wanted to become the light energy condor was that his girlfriend's breasts in the anime were really big. "I've decided." Lin 19's footsteps suddenly stopped, and his expression became serious. When Yuan looked back in confusion, she heard him shouting, "I must find a girlfriend with big breasts, otherwise it would be a loss." In the silence, Yuan began to look for her Yamanashi sword. Sure enough, she should first kill this embarrassing thing here and clean up the school for her teacher. Chapter 612. The next day, early in the morning, the weekly meeting in the teaching and research room. As usual, there was a lot of nonsense. Then there was the arrangement of academic affairs for the next week, the coordination of the internal affairs of the school, and many other trivial matters. These things had long been settled by the vice president. Now, at the meeting, it was announced to see who dared to stand up and speak up. Huai-Shur was still sitting in the corner like a salted fish. Headache. If he had known, he would not have drunk so much wine. After shrinking back a little, he lowered his head and pretended to be deep in thought, ready to take a short nap. But he noticed that there were frequent unsettling gazes from the top. He looked up and the sight disappeared. He looked down and the sight disappeared. He looked up and the sight disappeared again. He glared at Russell. What the hell was this old guy doing? But Russell was still drinking tea as if nothing had happened. It was full of arrangements. He snorted coldly and closed his eyes to rest. He looked as if he was not in the three realms, and it was futile. No matter what you arrange, don't expect me to respond. Finally, he heard a familiar voice from the top. Speaking of which, there is one more thing that I forgot to inform everyone. Russell put down his teacup and suddenly said, "Next month, our exchange with Kyoto University should also be on the agenda. We will set off this Friday with Mr. Isaac leading the team. In addition to the teams that have already been scheduled, in accordance with the principle of voluntary registration and participation, who would like to participate in the exchange." Although he said so, two eyes were staring straight at Huai-Shur. One was Russell, full of expectation, which meant, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up." The other was the vice president, full of disdain, which meant, "Go wherever you want, don't come." These two people stared straight at Huai-Shur. Huai-Shur, on the other hand, was wearing headphones, looking down at the music score in his notebook, as if he did not notice. After she calmly finished writing 2 pages, more and more people in the silent meeting room noticed the 2 people at the head of the table and looked over at Huai Shi. Huai Shi was still calm and collected. He was not moved at all. Want me to talk? Dream on. However, Russell was not angry or anxious. Instead, he took the initiative to speak. With concern and expectation for the younger generation, he asked kindly, Teacher Huai Shi, as a disaster musician, don't you want to communicate with the Yingzhou Philharmonic Orchestra? I'm sorry, Principal. Huai Shi raised his head and calmly retorted, their cellist skills are notoriously bad in the industry. There's nothing to talk about. Russell was stunned. Is that so? Yes, that's right. Huai Shi nodded solemnly with a look that said, I'm talking nonsense. I'm not going. Hit me if you have the ability. Since that's the case, let's have Teacher Huai Shi guide him. Russell smiled and turned to the vice principal. Write down his name. Motherf ***, are you waiting for me here? Sorry, it's my ex-girlfriend's birthday next month, so I have to take annual leave to go to London. Huai Shi made up a lie that he didn't even know what kind of lie it was and sighed sadly. Although I have lost this relationship, I hope there's still a glimmer of possibility to recover it. It doesn't matter even if it's a wasted trip. Russell was shocked. When did you have a girlfriend? Huai Shi smiled and raised his finger to point at his head. Principal, look at my face. Do I look like someone who can't find a girlfriend? Then, taking advantage of the short period of time when Russell was stunned, Huai Shi immediately used a stomachache as an excuse to leave early and run away. Oh, I've grown up, Russell. You want to set me up again? Dream on. In the afternoon, in the corridor outside the meditation room. Thank you for your long-term care, Professor. Sasaki knelt on the ground and bowed his head. Please forgive me for not staying long. Behind the paper door, an old voice coughed. Are you leaving now, Sasaki-kun? Sasaki didn't speak, but lowered his head and closed his eyes with guilt. It was difficult to repay the professor's kindness. Then go. Don't worry about me, an old man. Isn't this the so-called samurai? You have to set foot on the battlefield. The old man behind the paper door slowly got up and stared at the figure outside the door. After a long silence, the old man whispered, Kindness is important, but I also hope that one day I can drink with Sasaki-kun again. Just like in the story, when it's over, you and I will meet again under the cherry tree, drink, sing songs, and laugh. We won't go home until we're drunk. Even if we can't make it in time, it doesn't matter if the cherry blossoms fail. Please come back safely. The old man didn't say the last sentence in the end. He just tidied up his clothes, propped up his decaying body, sat upright, and said goodbye to the friend he met in the mortal world. Take care of yourself. Sasaki didn't speak anymore. He got up and left. He was already in tears. After seeing Sasaki off at the station, Huai Shi returned home. He was still immersed in the sadness of parting. Then, he saw the red letter on the table. Fang Shu, what's this? He scratched his head, instinctively feeling that something was wrong. I don't know. It was just sent by express, Fang Shu replied. I always feel that it's not a good thing. How about I throw it away for you? Huai Shi frowned, lowered his head, and carefully looked at the letter on the table, turning it around. It was as if he was looking at a bomb package. There was something wrong with this thing. But as soon as he picked up the letter, it disintegrated in his hand, revealing an iron plate the size of a business card, branded with the logo of the Cooking Demon Competition Organizing Committee. Hell, Cooking Demon Competition designated. The first line of big words made Huai Shi's eyes twitch. The aura of an arrangement came back again. Mr. Huai Shi, according to the customer's special request, you have a cooking demon competition to be held in Nara, Yingzhou, in half a month. We hope that you can continue to promote Hell's food and beverage culture in the competition, creating new achievements and new heights. Hell Cooking Demon Competition Organizing Committee. In the silence, Huai Shi's expression changed, as if on a color palette. Cooking Demon Competition designated, a designated task from the Hell Cooking Demon Competition Organizing Committee. Huaisher took a deep breath and roared at the sky. Russell, you old bastard! 10 minutes later, Huaisher finally finished cursing. He calmed down a little, pinched his chin, and thought for a while. Finally, he took out his phone and called Hupu. As if she had been waiting for a long time, the call was quickly connected. Stinky sister, who told you to call me? Huaisher asked bluntly. On the other end, Hupu was quite calm, and her answer was concise. Big cousin. Fine. Zhu Hongchen's arrangement was also on the way? What kind of shameful deal have the two of you made behind my back? Huaisher harumphed coldly, sorry, but I'm not going. The other party seemed to be in a good mood, as if she were laughing. You owe me a favor, Huaisher. Huaisher rolled his eyes. She was referring to the reminder Huaisher had given him when he had taken AI Qing with him. You can't possibly treat that as a favor, right? You were defeated by me, okay? Little sister Hupu, don't be mistaken. That's fine. Hupu shrugged. The mystic bird said that you also owe him a favor. Huaisher was once again rendered speechless. He could deny the first, but he couldn't deny the second. After all, he hadn't been able to control himself after being drugged by the origin reversal medicine, which had allowed him to ascend to the creation wood tier. He had gone in and out of the eastern summer country like he was in a hotel, jumping around repeatedly. The Azure Emperor had even lent him Mount Tai for free. If it had been anyone else, they would have died a long time ago. Did he think that the white wolf hook and painting scroll were a joke? After a long silence, Huaisher couldn't help but sigh. I say, the eastern summer country has a lot of businesses, so there's no need to keep an eye on a sheep like me, right? Who said that I'm only keeping an eye on you? Hupu asked back. Besides, although I really don't want to call you, I have to admit that you have advantages that others don't have. Good looks. Huaisher sneered. Miss, I sell my skills, not my body. Huaisher, if I wanted to find a male prostitute, there are plenty of them in the streets and alleys of the capital. Why would I find you to be unhappy? Hupu sighed. Of course it's because you're cheap. Huaisher was stunned. How cheap? 70 million. The number Hupu reported gave him a fright. Before Huaisher could squeeze out a sneer, he heard the unit Hupu added, US dollars. You call this cheap? Huaisher's knees suddenly went soft. He couldn't believe it. Do you Chinese all use money printing machines? What a joke. How can money printing machines make as much money as being Chinese? Hupu snorted in disdain. How much do you think the Rigian family's name and position as the head of the family is worth? How much is the Rigian family's family supervisor worth? The Anfang family's guardian? The Guan Shan Group's shares? Okay, stop talking. I know I'm a country bumpkin. Huaisher's face twitched. Although she gave a lot of money, Huaisher still didn't waver. Miss Hupu, even a country bumpkin has a backbone. Don't use money to humiliate me. Let's just leave it like this and, before he could finish the word see, he heard a voice from the other side. Yuji treasure. Huaisher frowned. What's Yuji? Do you guys build a treasure house just for matcha? You know what I'm talking about, Huaisher. Don't play dumb. Hupu said coldly. I'm talking about the capital city's equal court, the treasure house of Ingzhou's lineage, Yuji treasure. Didn't you want to say goodbye? Let's just leave it like this. Wait. Huaisher raised his voice. As a matcha lover, I want to hear a few more sentences. Tell me in detail. This is what I like to hear. On the other end of the phone, Rigian Hupu took a deep breath and resisted the urge to hack this guy to death through the phone. The capital city's equal court is one of the most important bases of Ingzhou's lineage. The Yuji treasure is where the origin codex of many stigmata miracles are stored. Among them, the most precious are the remains of the 4 great demons. They're comparable to the crystals of the Philosopher's Stone. They're shared by all Chinese. In fact, each family gets a few different portions. Rigian Hupo directly stated the price. If I can become the head, then the Rigian family's portion can be given to you. Huaishur swallowed his saliva and asked, "Please enlighten me. What are the 4 great demons?" Shutendaji, one of the pinnacle of Ingzhou's evil spirit. Atsuhimaru, formed by the degeneration of divinity. Tamamo, the demon fox with the highest degree of distortion. Finally, the 3rd generation De Tengu with the highest achievement in cultivation. You can choose from them. Even if the Rigian family doesn't have it, I'll exchange it for you. Seeing that Hupa had spoken up to this point, he changed the topic. However, this is something I'm giving you, so your job won't be as easy as before. Similarly, I can't give you an advance payment. Only by becoming the head will you have the right to enter. Therefore, you'll only be rewarded if you succeed. Let's get the ugly words out of the way first. You have to consider it carefully. Aya, look at what you're saying. Huaishur's voice suddenly became gentle. Hupa, you're really too much. We're so close and you're talking about rewards. My good sister is in trouble. How can I just stand by and watch her die? Enough. The girl on the other end of the phone took a deep breath. Please don't say things that make my stomach uncomfortable. What a coincidence. I also have stomach problems. Huaishur sighed sympathetically. The doctor said that it'll be fine if you live off a woman, but I'm afraid you don't have that ability. Huaishur. Cracking sounds came from the other end of the phone. It was as if the phone was about to be crushed. All right, there's no need to say any more. I'll be there next week. Huaishur rubbed his hands excitedly. Us brother and sister are of the same mind. Our sharpness can cut through metal. Come on, fight. Victory belongs to you, Hupa dear. Heart to heart bang. The phone was finally completely crushed. Chapter 6:13. After hanging up, Huaishur fell into silence and didn't say anything else. He sat on the chair and began to think. After the head of the Rigian family was dethroned, the key position that was left vacant. The foreseeable competition between the Rigian family's orthodox and side branches, as well as the endless internal strife between the Wu family and the Gong family, as well as the infiltration of Dongsha's genealogy, the showdown between the chef and demon, the arrangement of the ivory tower and the reward promised by Hu Po in the end. The remains of the 4 great demons in the Yuji treasure. They were known as treasures on the same level as the Philosopher's Stone. Their existence until now was not only because of their power, but also because of their position in history, which laid the foundation for Ingzhou's genealogy. It was like an antique that was displayed in a museum. They were all testimonies left behind in history, proof of the genealogy's past. As evil beings, the degree of distortion on them was shocking, but the correction value built on this foundation was not small either. As origin books, they had spread countless disasters, but at the same time, gave birth to countless miracles. If they were used as materials for alchemy, they would be able to create rare treasures. If they were used as food, Huaishur lowered his head and stared at the blood-red imperial god blade on his knees. Amidst the endless resentment, there was an unquenchable sense of hunger and thirst. It was the ferocious nature of the crow hidden under their pious praise. During their evolution, not only did they not feel satisfied, they became even more desperate, craving for more food, more disasters, and more miracles. If that's the case, it's not a bad trip? Huaishur let out a long breath, looked at Tongyi who had unknowingly appeared beside him, and asked, "Do you have any suggestions?" Tongyi thought for a bit. Eat and drink well, bring some souvenirs, and don't pick the wildflowers by the roadside? Huaishur rolled his eyes. Be serious, anything else? Also, come to the basement tonight, I have something to tell you, I think it's time to teach you Great Si Ming's transformation technique. Tongyi's smile gradually brightened. Let me say this in advance. This ritual is very dangerous. How to use it and how to seize the opportunity will depend on you. Don't go overboard. From that smile, Huai Shi sensed the familiar premonition of death. He sighed in understanding. All right, it's time to persecute me again, isn't it? In fact, this journey probably wouldn't be smooth sailing at all. From the very beginning, it made people feel that their lives were full of misfortune. In the afternoon of the next day, Huai Shi received a call asking him to go to the school office as soon as possible because there was something important to inform him. I'm sorry, Secretary Huai. Your passport was returned. The commissioner coughed a few times. Ingzhou refused to issue your passport and issued a warning and complaint to the ivory tower. Huai Shi was dumbfounded. What the hell? We don't know about this either. The commissioner said to Huai Shi with an indescribable expression, for some reason, Looming Hall listed you as a dangerous person and issued a warrant for you. Also, they claimed that you still have several crimes in Ingzhou that are under prosecution, including impersonating a national civil servant and espionage. Do you have any clues? How would I know? Huai Shi widened his eyes and retorted in a trembling voice, This is slander, complete slander. It's Looming Hall's despicable and shameless framing. Poor innocent people like me, the pillar of the Astronomy Association, the purple gold beam of the ivory tower, a young and promising upright man, have suffered such unfair treatment. The sun is shining, the sun is shining. I've made contributions to the present world, I've shed blood in hell. I want to appeal to the Astronomy Association. I want to appeal. He said that he wanted to appeal. In fact, Huai Shi did appeal. The efficiency of the Astronomy Association was as outstanding as ever. 10 minutes later, a call came from the Countermeasure Secretariat of the Ingzhou Governance Bureau. A voice full of respect and humility expressed his understanding of Huai Shi with a tone full of guilt, anger, and indignation. He complained about the despicable act of Looming Hall, and then inadvertently mentioned Huai Shi's ranking on the internal blacklist of the Xinhua Seven Stars Group. In the end, the other party said that they already knew about this matter and would soon organize a meeting to discuss and solve it. They were already doing it and were on the way. So, please rest assured and teach in the ivory tower. The Ingzhou Governance Bureau branch will definitely give you an explanation. Although the wording was very polite and general, if it was translated concisely, it would become very straightforward. Stinky brother, who are you trying to fool? Think about what you've done in the past. It's only been a little more than a year since the Asian Rookie competition. The Looming Hall is still looking at you from the old crooked tree. The last time you, a member of the Astronomy Association, got involved in the Battle of Yamatai City, do you know how many times our local gang wiped your ass for you? Why are you still jumping into the pit now? Just stay in the ivory tower obediently. In all fairness, as a brother unit, the Ingzhou Governance Bureau was already very kind. Otherwise, the Looming Hall's bounty and the Seven Stars Group's bounty wouldn't stop at the level of shouting. But they really didn't want to help. These days, it was already very difficult for the Governance Bureau to remain neutral in the struggle between the Wu family and the Gong family. Especially recently, the situation had begun to become turbulent again. All kinds of messy things had already caused the members of the Countermeasure headquarters to lose a lot of hair. The ousting of the Rigian family was just a fuse. No one knew what kind of storm would come next. At this juncture, when they heard that the infamous Jinx in the Asian Governance Bureau was going to jump into the gunpowder warehouse at their doorstep and give everyone a job, the head of the customs at the border was scared. Brother, can't we just stop for a moment? Isn't the rice in the ivory tower delicious? Why did you come to Ingzhou to eat this cold lunch? In short, if he didn't complain, he wouldn't have known. But once he complained, he was shocked. Huai Shi was shocked to find that his reputation had reached the edge of a dangerous cliff. He was dumbfounded. He felt that something was **king wrong. What the hell are you doing? I'm already prepared here, But you're banning me from entering the country? Do you bastards know how much determination I made and how much mental struggle I had to do? Besides, do you think you can stop me like this? In fact, they could really stop him. As long as the Ingzhou Governance Bureau was determined not to let Huai Shi get involved in this matter, there were 100,000 soft nails that could knock him back. Even if Huai Shi took the risk to sneak into Ingzhou, once he was exposed, there would be hundreds of commissioners accompanying him to a hot spring villa deep in the mountains to recuperate until this matter was over. It was difficult. Just as Huai Shi was about to go bald, Russell, who had appeared out of nowhere, finally had enough of the commotion and slowly opened his mouth. He said slowly, "Speaking of which, I do have an idea." However, when Huai Shi's hope was rekindled, he saw that old face begin to sigh with regret. "But you can't go because it's your ex-girlfriend's birthday, right? Then forget it. After all, I'm not a demon. Feelings are a lifelong thing. They're definitely more important than work. Can I force you?" "What ex-girlfriend? A good horse doesn't go back to pasture. A breakup is a breakup. A broken mirror can't be reunited." Huai Shi replied without hesitation, "I only have work in my heart now. Work makes me happy." "Sigh, I'm so pleased that you can think like this." Russell sighed again. "But the list of members of the exchange team has already been decided. I can't arrange it." "Old bastard, don't go too far." Huai Shi's expression twitched. He squeezed out a smile. "It's okay. I'm willing to contribute to the ivory tower. I'll take annual leave to do voluntary work. I don't want money. I definitely won't cause trouble for the exchange team." Russell pondered for a moment and couldn't help but sigh again. He glanced at Huai Shi and shook his head. "But this idea is a little difficult. I'm afraid you won't be able to accept it. There's only a challenge when there's difficulty." Huai Shi patted his chest loudly and promised in a booming voice, "As the guardian of the present realm, what kind of difficulties have I not seen before? I'll go through mountains of knives and seas of fire." "All right. Since you insist on going, as your teacher, I can't stop you." Russell sighed. He had a good time acting as a helpless teacher who couldn't persuade his stubborn disciple. It was only when Huai Shi's teeth were about to shatter that he put his hands behind his back and walked away. "Come with me. I have something for you." Not long after, the safe in Russell's office was opened. A heavy metal box was pulled out and placed on the table. After blowing off the non-existent dust, Russell carefully wiped his hands and opened the combination lock on top. "This is the gift I prepared for you on the day you became my student. Originally, I wanted to give it to you when you finished your apprenticeship, but I think it's time for you to need it now." Following the old man's actions, the treasure that had been sleeping in front of Huai Shi finally revealed its true appearance. In the long silence, Huai Shi stood rooted to the ground. He raised his head stiffly and widened his eyes. "What is this?" Under the reflection of the yellow sunlight outside the window, the pure white inside the metal box glowed faintly. It was dreamy and illusory, as if it was calling out to its future owner. The meticulous tailoring from the designer highlighted the extraordinary taste and design, and the lace embellished on the collar and chest made it look even more elegant and sweet. Look at the snow-white color, look at the meticulous workmanship, and look at the elegant aura that greeted the face. Which sensible student would refuse such a gift? Which girl wouldn't be moved to tears when receiving it, understanding the teacher's encouragement and expectations for her? Just like that, with the strong expectations of the elders, a dress was delivered to Huai Shi. "Try it on. Is the size suitable?" Russell smiled. Chapter 6:14. "Sis, I'm going out." On Friday evening, Yuan Zhao bent down to pick up his backpack and suitcase. He turned around to say goodbye to his cousin, who was sending him to the door. Yuan looked at his fully armed appearance and asked again, "Did you bring everything?" "Yes, I brought everything. Don't worry." Yuan Zhao grinned and gave her a thumbs up. It was as if he was going on a study trip, full of sunshine. He didn't look very reliable. Yuan sighed. Where's the key that second uncle gave you? It's also in my pocket. Yuan Zhao patted his pocket. I'm just going out. Maybe I won't have anything to do there. Sis, don't worry. Yuan didn't say anything. She wanted to tell him to pay attention to his safety, but such words were meaningless to the people of the Social Security Bureau. How could she not know what kind of powder keg Ingzhou was now? Plus, her cousin was so unreliable. If he went there, he might jump into a fire or a mountain of knives. But as the eldest son of the Yuan family, how could he escape such a fate? After thinking for a long time, she only said, I hope he can come back safely. Don't worry, there's Huaishe. Yuan Zhao waved his hand. If there's anything, let him take care of it. I'm too lazy to stick my head out. Yuan's expression suddenly became complicated. Teacher might not be able to go. After a moment of silence, the girl sighed. It's said that a few days ago, he wanted to sneak into the earth and was caught on the spot by the self-defense forces, but he was extradited by the Astronomy Society. He should still be in London now, right? Although he knew that his cousin was worried, Yuan Zhao couldn't help but laugh out loud. He became more and more excited. Ha 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 ha, if you visit him in prison, remember to make fun of him for me. Yuan Zhao raised his eyebrows and whistled. Let him stay in London. This time, the real protagonist will appear. Ah, the sense of mission that hit him in the face. This familiar sense of inheritance. That's right, the foreshadowing was over. Next, it was time for the real hero, the future star of Dongxia, Yuan Zhao, to appear. After leaving the door, Yuan Zhao couldn't help but dance with joy. With every step he took, he seemed to smell the fragrance of freedom. The sense of relief, the sense of anticipation, and the refreshing breeze that blew in his face. Do you hear that, Yuan Zhao? That's cousin calling out to you. Filled with hope, the young Yuan Zhao ran on the path towards the future. Ingzhou, figurines, models, and girls, I'm coming. Although he had a mission from the Social Security Bureau, Yuan Zhao was still a student of the Ivory Tower in name. If he wanted to enter Ingzhou, he couldn't use the name of Dongxia genealogy. As a member of the academic exchange team, although Yuan Zhao didn't know anything about academics, it didn't stop him from looking cute and sweet. Sorry, subconsciously. I didn't do it on purpose. I just came over to get to know you. You can continue reading. I won't disturb you. Until he returned to his seat in a daze. There was a dazed smile on his face. He was completely out of his wit. He was still holding the business card in his hand. He couldn't believe that he succeeded in striking up a conversation so easily and even got her phone number. He waited until he got on the bus and was still intoxicated by this sudden joy and surprise. What was rare was that Yuan Zhao didn't have the time to laugh at Huaishe when he talked about that bastard with others. His eyes kept involuntarily looking behind him. Even the seniors opposite him noticed it and couldn't help but cover their mouths and snicker. However, he noticed that Motoko didn't seem to be able to blend in with the group. Since she couldn't speak, she couldn't participate in everyone's conversation. She could only sit alone at the back and read and stare blankly. Yuan Zhao wanted to talk to her, but he didn't know what to say. He could only look at her from afar. However, Vice Principal Isaac seemed to have a lot of opinions about her. When they talked in private, his expression seemed to be angry and cold, as if he was ordering something. Poor Motoko, a weak girl, couldn't speak. She could only nod awkwardly and try to smile. It was too much. After a few times, even the other professors and students felt that the vice principal was too strict this time. They used work as an excuse to pull him away. Motoko. Ahem, Miss Motoko, don't be afraid. Yuan Zhao finally gathered his courage and sat over. He said solemnly, If Mr. Isaac is angry again, I will help you. The girl looked at him in shock. She couldn't believe it and widened her eyes. She seemed a little embarrassed. After a long time, she nodded gently. She shyly lowered her eyes. Yuan Zhao was stunned for a long time. His face was flushed, and he felt that his heart was about to melt. After the foreshadowing just now, he finally had a chance to talk to the little sister. Motoko didn't seem to care that he was stuttering and didn't know how to chat. She always listened patiently and nodded her head in agreement from time to time. But she would occasionally look in the vice principal's direction. Obviously, she was still a little scared and had a shadow in her heart. This made Yuan Zhao even angrier. This Isaac was really too much. What kind of teacher was he to bully a girl? He must be a beast with a human face and has some bad thoughts about Miss Motoko. He was even more determined to protect the little sister. In the distance, Vice Principal Isaac also seemed to look over. He couldn't help but want to get up several times, but he was stopped by his colleagues. They tried their best to persuade him, but they couldn't affect Yuan Zhao and Motoko's alone time. He was anxious. Yuan Zhao saw this and sneered in his heart. He actually changed his position and blocked the vice principal's prying eyes with his body. He smiled at the stunned Motoko. Motoko was stunned for a moment, but she also showed him a grateful smile. She thought emotionally, "Fuck, this stinky brother is so annoying. What the hell is Yuan Zhao doing? Vice Principal, please come and save me?" But this time, no matter how much Miss Motoko prayed in her heart, Mr. Isaac couldn't save her from the abyss of suffering. Yuan Zhao kept talking along the way. By the time they reached Yingzhou, Miss Motoko already knew that he was a young and promising man from Dongxia. He had a house, a car, and a horse at home. He was the future backbone of the Social Security Bureau and a famous Gamecock streamer. He also had two very powerful sisters. His father was very strict, and his mother was very gentle. His brothers and sisters were very good. Also, she had to be very careful and vigilant of a beast in human clothing called Huaishur. It was said that he liked to play with ignorant girls like her. Once she fell into the hands of that pervert, she would be done this and that. In the end, she would be covered with the word official and would never be able to escape from that perverted demon's control and exploitation. But she didn't have to be afraid, because this stinky brother in front of her would definitely protect her. Damn it, I've had enough. Beelzebub, who was in the backpack, had been laughing wildly since this morning. He hadn't stopped for 12 hours. Miss Motoko felt like she was going crazy. But this stinky brother in front of her wasn't done yet. If she wasn't worried that her identity would be exposed, Miss Motoko would have pulled him into the toilet, lifted her skirt, and let him know what it meant to be bigger than her. Fortunately, the train finally arrived at the station just before Suzy could no longer hold back and was about to vomit. Yingzhou, the capital, welcome. Chapter 6:15. There's no way I can live like this. Huaishur sighed. He lowered his head and looked at the completely unfamiliar girl in the mirror in the washroom. When he realized that this was him, he felt a headache coming on. Tongi, that bad girl, couldn't she make herself uglier? Why did she have to make herself look so good? It was a mistake to ask her to dress up for him from the beginning. Also, Hupo's stupid sister must pay more. Otherwise, his great sacrifice would have been in vain. After cursing Russell, that old bastard who only wanted to see him make a fool of himself, in his mind, Huaishur opened his small bag and began to touch up his makeup while Beelzebub was mocking him. Did he not take good care of himself recently? He felt like he had wrinkles on his forehead. After more than 10 minutes, he finally realized what was wrong. His thinking was too slippery. He felt that if this continued, he would become strange. He had to change his image. After pondering for a while, Huaishur nimbly braided 2 village girls' hair. Then he took out a pair of old-fashioned glasses from his backpack and put them on his nose bridge. He looked up. For some reason, he felt even worse. After a long time, he could only change back to his original appearance. He sighed and walked out of the washroom. Only when he heard the foreign language around him and saw the small crow's books for sale in the station's booths did he realize that he had come to Ingzhou. The interior of the station was quite modern. Ascenders gathered and dispersed here. Soon, they would merge into the flow of people from the upper level of Jingdu Station from various paths and then go in all directions. After all, it was one of the few large transportation hubs between the present realm and the border. It did not seem deserted or crowded. However, as he walked, Huai Shi instinctively sensed a strange gaze coming from behind him, as well as a discordant voice following him slowly among the many footsteps. Someone was following him. He was being watched as soon as he got off the train. His footsteps paused. Suddenly, he took a detour. He did not go to the place where the ivory tower connected. Instead, he casually strolled around the shops in the station. He took the stalker in the crowd, who thought that he had hidden well, for a walk. With the perception and ability of the mirror of nothingness, Huai Shi was quite sensitive to all the emotions that fell on him, especially those that pretended to inadvertently cast glances at him from behind. If he didn't know how to suppress his own emotions, even the most careful gazes would trigger a change in Huai Shi's origin substance. In the crowd, the girl in the white dress suddenly stopped in her track. The crowd at the crossroad gathered briefly, and when they separated again, the figure had already disappeared without a trace. The tracker, who was dressed like a backpacker, was stunned for a moment. He took off his sunglasses and looked over, but he couldn't find any trace of her. He frowned. He didn't rush forward to investigate. Instead, he took 2 steps back and turned to leave. In a slightly dark corner, Huai Shi's inconspicuous figure appeared. This was the innate concealment advantage of being in the dark. After 2 advanced enhancements, the bone burial sanctum could form an effect similar to invisibility even in a slightly dimly lit place. Coupled with the concealment skill, countering such tracking was not a problem at all. But what Huai Shi was more curious about was who was following him. Was he exposed as soon as he got off the train? That's not right. If it was someone from the Ingzhou governing authority, they would have taken a photo and asked him to cooperate with the investigation. There was no need for sneaky tracking. He had the Book of Destiny. No matter who took his position, they could only conclude that he was now receiving an investigation and education in London. After the Ingzhou countermeasure room sent him back, they probably wouldn't waste too much manpower on this problem. Then, who would have evil thoughts about the weak and pitiful Miss Huai Shi? He followed. But he found that the backpacker, after a few turns, actually turned into the men's toilet. Had he been discovered? He was stunned for a moment. On the other side, the backpacker who turned into the toilet vigilantly identified that no one was following him through the mirror on the sink. He lifted the sunglasses on his face, washed his hands casually, stood in front of the urinal, and began to whistle. Behind him, the old cleaner who cleaned the toilet hummed a song and lowered his head to mop the floor. The backpacker raised his head and looked straight at the decorative painting on the tiles as he said casually, "Director, my surveillance target may have discovered me." Huai Shi Suzi. The old cleaner paused for a moment and frowned. Is there really a problem? The introduction on the exchange team's list. How can a female student who is a translator have this ability? There must be a problem. The backpacker asked, "Has the intelligence department checked her background? It said that she's the daughter of a rich family in the Guanxi area." Weak? A bunch of useless people who sit in the office every day and don't know how to work without a search engine. The old cleaner complained unhappily and said, "I will report it and increase her vigilance. Your mission continues. Change the surveillance target. Remember, the ivory tower needs to be a highly vigilant target. Don't make any mistakes and don't be rash." The implication was that if they couldn't handle it, they should be more cautious. Everyone was here to get paid, so they shouldn't make any trouble to cover the national flag. After all, they weren't in charge after leaving the station. The rest would be left to the elites of the first bat. Okay. Experiencing the concern from his superior, the backpacker couldn't help but laugh. Then, he frowned. Also, who came up with this stupid idea of meeting in the toilet? Me. The director took off his cap and scratched his white hair. He stood in front of the urinal and couldn't help but sigh. When people get old, it's easy to urinate and can't hold it in. Sometimes, I can't even pee after standing for a long time. It's better for my bladder to be near the toilet. By the way, Yamada, why can't you pee? There's someone next to me. I'm nervous. The backpacker Yamada couldn't help but sigh. I told you not to drink with Hanma and the others. Director, you're already so old. Why don't you admit defeat? I'm still young. The director snorted and lowered his head, looking disdainfully at his subordinate's outrageous look. Look, Yamada. Compared to your soft water gun, my torrent is so strong. Yamada wanted to roll his eyes. I'm not looking. It hurts my eyes too much. Although he said that, the sound of water splashing came from beside him. It stunned him for a long time. He couldn't believe it. Wait, isn't this too unreasonable? In the end, he couldn't help but look to the side. He saw the figure standing between the two of them. He froze on the spot. He didn't know when she had appeared. A pure and adorable girl with a hint of sweetness was standing shoulder to shoulder with them. She lifted her white dress, whistled, and peed in satisfaction. She swayed proudly. The old cleaner and the backpacker froze on the spot. They opened their mouths in a daze, but they couldn't say anything. They couldn't even make a sound. When the sound of water gradually disappeared, she put down her white dress again, hiding the indescribably terrifying thing in the darkness of the taboo again. Then, she raised her hands and put them on their shoulders rather intimately. She comforted them earnestly. Everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. There's nothing to feel inferior about. It's fine as long as you have enough, right? No one responded. The two of them, who were about to turn into wax under the fierce poison, still maintained their dumbfounded posture. Their pupils trembled, and they could not hide their panic. Then, the girl who suddenly appeared asked in a man's voice, "Looming Hall?" Yamada's pupils shook twice in fear. It was as if he was denying it. She thought for a moment and asked again, "Seat?" Her pupils continued to shake. It was expected. After all, they were just two noobs who had sublimated. One was a second order, and the other was a first order. They didn't seem to be from a violent organization within the Ingzhou genealogy. Could it be MPD? This time, the two secret police from the Kyoto Metropolitan Police Department finally began to blink crazily. Okay then, thank you for your cooperation. Miss Huai-Chi nodded and turned to the sink. After washing her hands, she turned around and said, "Although I don't know why you are following me, the price for following a beautiful girl like me is to have a good sleep for 2 months." As she said that, she looked back and smiled. Sweet dreams. As soon as she finished speaking, the two of them fell to the ground and fainted from the high fever. Miss Huai-Chi picked up her backpack again and walked out of the door. She narrowed her eyes slightly in the crowd. Finally, she understood the tension of the situation. Even the Kyoto Metropolitan Police Department began to monitor the situation at the border station. It seemed that Ingzhou was really not peaceful recently. Miss Huai-Chi?" A sudden voice of surprise sounded. He had searched for her thousands of times in the crowd. When Yuan Zhao suddenly turned around, he was pleasantly surprised to see the woman he had been thinking about in his heart, walking out of the men's washroom. The smile of joy froze on his face. "Miss Huai-Chi, are you stupid, stinky brother?" Huai Shi smiled, waved goodbye to him, turned around and walked away. Yuan Zhao was left alone in a daze. He looked back at her departing figure and the men's washroom in front of him. He was stunned. What was going on? Why no, it must be because the women's washroom was full. That's right, so that's why. That must be it. He didn't expect Miss Huai-Chi to be so casual and flexible. She was really amazing. Just like that, with hope in his heart, Yuan Zhao walked into the washroom. He lowered his head and saw the two men on the ground. His smile gradually disappeared. A burly man with dark skin and a wretched old man were lying on the ground. Their faces were flushed and their clothes were disheveled. He thought of Miss Huai Chi's satisfied smile again. He didn't know why, but tears fell down uncontrollably. On this day, the 15-year-old Yuan Zhao finally witnessed the legendary world of darkness that only adults knew about. At that moment, a cracking sound came from the boy's chest. Yuan Zhao's love heart was broken. Chapter 6:16. It didn't matter what the world was like anymore. Ingzhou or whatever, it didn't matter. Missions from the Social Security Bureau, it didn't matter. They were all meaningless things. When Yuan Zhao walked out of the bathroom in a daze, he seemed to have changed into a different person. He hunched his back and followed the team from the ivory tower dejectedly. He was like a walking corpse. When the seniors looked over, their eyes became sympathetic. This young man probably failed in his confession. He had to suffer more beatings from society in order to grow. Come on, Yuan Zhao, don't lose to yourself. But in Yuan Zhao's eyes, those words of encouragement didn't matter anymore. The outside world was too scary. Sister Yuan, I want to go home at this moment. He only wanted to return to his warm room, take a bath, drink a cup of hot tea, curl up into a ball in the heavy cup, and then cover his head and cry until he had no strength left, and then fall into a deep sleep. It would be best if he didn't dream and never woke up again. The three-dimensional world was too dirty. He wanted to go back to his two-dimensional world. Just as he rubbed his red eyes and couldn't help but feel sad, he heard a voice in front of him. Is it snowing? It's only November, so early. Then I can take the time to go skiing? I want to soak in the hot springs. I heard that there are wild monkeys on the mountain. Almond, can you come with me? Okay, I'll accompany you no matter what you do. Looking at the affectionate couple, Yuan Zhao looked away numbly and snorted in disdain. Stupid three-dimensional world, do you think you can hurt me like this? My heart is already, he wanted to say that his heart was already dead. But when he raised his head and looked into the distance, he saw the snow powder slowly falling from the sky of the square, the neon lights, and the slender figure at the end of the crowd. She stood in the pure white falling snow. She seemed to have blended into this pure world. It was hard to tell them apart. Only her long hair fluttered in the wind. Her black eyes were illuminated by the light in the distance. She raised her hand in surprise to catch the snowflakes falling from the sky with a childlike and pure smile. She was like a fairy in the snow. She didn't belong to this world. Miss Huaiji Yuan Zhao froze in place. With a plop, it was as if a needle had been injected into his chest. His originally shattered heart was once again mended, fiercely beating for a moment, causing his dying soul to once again shine with hope. He was ready. Yes, Yuan Zhao, it's still too early to give up. He hadn't asked anything and didn't know anything. He had only seen some discordant things, which might not be the truth. Besides, even if, just as he was feeling conflicted and wanted to go up, he realized that the figure had already disappeared into the crowd. Gone. Yuan Zhao widened her eyes and looked at the group beside her. To her surprise, she discovered that she was not in the exchange team. Where did she go? Miss Huaiji's schedule is different from ours. The vice principal stopped beside him for a moment, then glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. Also, Mr. Yuan, as a member of the Ivory Tower, you may not have much of a sense of identity with the school, but please try not to cause trouble in your next solo operation. Especially, don't bear the name of the Ivory Tower, he warned sternly. Regarding the two secret police in the washroom, the MPD has already issued a serious warning to us. I hope this kind of thing won't happen again. Washroom? Secret police? Yuan Zhao finally understood. So it's like this, I understand. Nothing filthy as he imagined had happened. Miss Suko only chose to fight back after being harassed by the two secret police. That's great, that's really great. In the silence, Isaac saw the expression of the young man in front of him constantly changing. At first, he was stunned, then he couldn't help but reveal a relieved smile. In the end, he was so moved that he actually cried. "No, little brother, what's wrong with you?" He took a step back in shock, his eyes filled with disdain. Another crazy. JPG. He was completely unaware of how this scene looked to others. Hey, did you see that? The vice principal first bullied Miss Huaiji, and now he actually made the most tender little brother in the group cry. This is too outrageous, too much of a bully. Isaac's reputation continued to be damaged in the end. When Yuan Zhao finally calmed down a little, Isaac raised his eyes and looked at the car that had been waiting for a long time next to the square. "The person who came to pick you up has arrived. Mr. Yuan Zhao, you should go," he said. "Please remember, no matter what you do, you must come back when the academic exchange officially begins in half a month." Yuan Zhao nodded, wiped his tears, and turned to leave. Isaac's lips opened and closed for a moment, but he was silent for a moment. In the end, he only said coldly, "I really hope that the next time we meet again is not at your funeral or in the prison cell of Looming Hall." He retracted his gaze and stopped looking. The car had already left with Yuan Zhao. It went straight in the direction of Ingzhou Bridge. The great entrance to the second dimension. What Nara? Miss Huaiji had disappeared, no mood. Next time. 5 minutes ago, Miss Suko, the fairy in the snow, did not notice a certain young man who had reignited his hope not far away. She looked up at the falling snow in the sky and thought in her heart, "Damn it, I'm so cold. I'm going to buy a down jacket." He turned and walked into the mall. When he came out half an hour later, he had already changed his clothes. He wore a down jacket, jeans, a knitted hat, and a pair of huge sunglasses. He didn't look like the pure, innocent, and pitiful girl from before. He was fed up with the scene where a group of people would snort when he picked his nostrils. Thinking of those disgusting peeping eyes, Huaishir suddenly trembled with anger. His hands and feet were cold. Could this world be better? He finally realized that it was not easy for women. Now, he could finally practice martial arts openly. From this point, it seemed that it could be considered an advantage. He was not as licentious as a certain young man who was like a wild dog out of control. Huaishir, who was paid to do things, at least had a sense of responsibility. He directly bought a JR Express to Nara. After eating something, he planned to go to Nara today first. Before meeting Hu Po, he wanted to figure out the current situation in Nara. At least he didn't want to jump into the mud. If the situation was out of his expectations, Huaishir would turn around and leave without hesitation. Then he would think of a way to fish in troubled waters and get a ticket from the Equal Academy. After all, it was Huaishir who stole things. What did it have to do with Huaishir? Unknowingly, Huaishir's moral values were getting lower and lower, and his conscience was getting less and less. On the JR Express platform, Huaishir leaned back in his chair. Behind the sunglasses, he couldn't help but look into the distance at the other end of the booth. It was as if a bear was standing there. It was eye-catching. In fact, it wasn't just him. The people around him couldn't help but look over and whisper to each other. There was no other reason. It was because the back of that figure was too burly. More than 2 meters tall, a burly middle-aged white man covered in muscles. His abnormally pale skin was covered with layers of tattoos. Even his face was covered with a skull. Messy hair casually fell down his back. He wore sunglasses that were bigger than Huaishir's. He had a headset on his head and chewed gum in his mouth. His face was full of stubble, and there were layers of gold chains around his wrists and neck. He looked like a punk. Next to him was a suitcase that was almost as tall as him. It was emitting a fierce aura which made people pay attention to it. Sensing the gazes of the people around him, the man wasn't angry. Instead, He leaned on his suitcase complacently, looking at those gazes. When he saw the figure in the distance, his eyes lit up. He opened his mouth and greeted her in shaky Latin. "Miss, do you want to sit with me? I think we'll have a good trip." After saying that, he arched his biceps. His oversized black t-shirt was squeezed so much that it almost burst open. "Miss, your mother's leg." Huaishe rolled his eyes. He didn't want to bother with him, so he raised his middle finger. The burly man laughed and retracted his gaze. He didn't continue to pester her. Instead, he continued to indulge in the rap song that came from his headset. His body slightly twisted, as if there was no one around. However, the familiar smell on his body made Huaishe instantly know his identity. He was the same as him. Hell's cooking demon. They were both going to Nara. A cooking demon duel? Was there really going to be a cooking demon competition in the capital? The corners of Huaishe's eyes began to twitch wildly. He was starting to get bald. They didn't have to wait too long. The train arrived on time. Now that Huaishe was ostracized by the local gangs, he naturally couldn't use the local astronomical society's network to search for information. However, this was the time when the collection of 10,000 sins came in handy. As a super-large DD Beats man, this absolutely illegal software included all kinds of businesses that could not exist under the sun, including but not limited to murder, arson, kidnapping, extortion, perjury, border auction of relics, and even all kinds of illegal acts that humans could think of. Back then, the Chi family even bought their legs on it. Now that he thought about it, he really missed it. Of course, as a member of the Astronomical Society, Huaishe, who was determined to protect the present world, had such a software installed on his phone. It was also natural that he had a VIP Level 9 membership that he shared with Tanguy. In fact, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had done a lot of fishing on it. He had posted countless posts like, "Good sister, I want to continue working hard. I urgently need border poison. I want to kill the rich woman I married. Can you help me?" He would also post a photo of himself to increase his persuasiveness, and then wait for the idiot to walk into the trap. The collection of 10,000 sins didn't care about this at all. Double-crossing was a part of the illegal world. If you didn't like it, don't play. Therefore, at least in the Dongsha section, Huaishe's photo had become a thorn in the side of many people. It was a pity that criminals these days learned too quickly. Otherwise, Huaishe's previous performance would have increased a lot. Just as the train started to move, the passenger sitting across from Huaishe finally got on. She was still talking on the phone. "Zhenshi, be careful on the road." "Okay, Mom. I'm just going to go through the process. I'm already on the train. Uncle Yanjing will pick me up when I arrive. I'll hang up first." After hanging up the phone, the girl, who was about the age of a high school student, smiled embarrassedly at Huaishe. Through the gap between the sunglasses, she saw a pair of eyes looking up. She was stunned for a moment, then immediately realized that she was being rude. She quickly looked away, her cheeks a little hot. Huaishe didn't care about her appearance. Anyway, this kind of vulgar girl couldn't compare to him in terms of beauty. His gaze swept across JK, then continued to look up. He raised his head slightly and looked at the roof of the train. He raised his eyebrows. There was someone up there. Chapter 6:17. Someone was on the roof of the car. From the faint vibration of the car, an abnormal echo could be felt on the roof. It was a faint vibration caused by tiptoeing. The technique was indeed flawless and admirable. It was even as light as a falling leaf. But this was where the biggest failure came from. How could a falling leaf crawl like a person? Moreover, it was on the roof of the exhilarating Shinkansen. It was probably a train rider. This level of skill was probably not even at the level of the Orchard Gym experience class. After Huaishe glanced at it, he looked away with disinterest. Then, he felt the girl's body tense up. Intentionally or unintentionally, she looked over. She looked at Huaishur, thinking that she would not attract attention. Lousy snooping. Difficult to understand. But all this didn't seem to be the case to the girl opposite him. When Huaishur raised her head to look up and then looked away, her heart skipped a beat and she froze on the spot. Ah, it seems like a strange big sister rolled her eyes. What's going on? Was he being rude? What did I do wrong? She sat in her seat, her heart in a mess. She felt an inexplicable panic. Was it because she didn't take a shower? No, I just took a shower before I went out. Thinking of this, she quickly pulled up her collar and sniffed twice. She took a deep breath. There was only the smell of laundry detergent. It was the same on her hair, hands, and body. There were no strange stains or smells. Was it because the phone call disturbed her? That couldn't be right. She just sat down and hung up the phone. She even apologized. No one should care about such a small matter, right? Could it be, suddenly, a bolt of lightning flashed across her mind. Was it because her clothes were too old-fashioned? Was this the legendary regional discrimination? Subconsciously, Makoto lowered her head and looked at her clothes. She bought a checkered coat online, gloves that she had worn for a long time, a long dress that she had casually bought from the shopping street in her hometown, thick stockings bought from a convenience store, and tasteless sneakers, as well as her rustic long hair that had no sense of design and was just casually combed twice. Looking at the opposite side, her navy blue down jacket perfectly accentuated her slender waist, and her jeans perfectly wrapped around her slender legs without any embellishments. She had the perfect figure of a model, a slender neck, and a pair of plain white canvas shoes that surpassed all the ugly ducklings. A pair of huge sunglasses covered half of her beautiful face, and under the knitted hat, her enviable long hair flowed down like a black stream. She intentionally dressed in a gender-neutral manner, which didn't reveal many of her female characteristics. Instead, she gave off a seductive vibe unique to tomboys, which gave off a fatal allure. This was already a terrifying level that could kill both men and women. Moreover, they were all brands that she couldn't recognize. They must be very expensive. For the first time in her life, Shi, who had grown up in the countryside, was now a 17-year-old female high school student, and was now in the prime of her life, felt the superiority and disdain of the people of Kyoto. The people of the capital were too scary. She curled up in the chair, shivering. Inconceivably, she didn't feel angry at all when a strange woman rolled her eyes at her. She felt just like a swan proudly swam past an ugly duckling. She didn't feel angry or resentful at all. Instead, she was attracted by Shi's unusual beauty. She wanted to get closer. She wanted to observe her closely and get closer to her big sister. Just the thought of such a beautiful woman sitting across from her made Shi's face redden. She mustered her courage and looked up from her cell phone screen again. Then, she saw her raise her hand and take off the sunglasses on her face. A pair of black eyes looked over and met Makoto's gaze. She seemed to be asking, "Why are you looking at me?" Sorry. She stiffened for a moment and shrunk her neck, not daring to look again. But she couldn't help but regret. I shouldn't have talked to her just now. Even if it was just a self-introduction, would she have told me her name? She could feel her heart beating madly in her chest. Dokidoki. She was beginning to panic. Unbelievable. Her fingers trembled as she opened up a web page and began searching to verify her suspicions. Soon, she was astonished to discover something. For the first time in her 17 years of life, the person she was attracted to was actually a woman? Was there something wrong with her mind? Normally speaking, shouldn't girls like boys? Or was it that she had abnormal cells that she hadn't even noticed before? Mommy, save me! In her panic, she suddenly got up and stood at attention. She wanted to go to the bathroom to escape from reality. But her tense body still hadn't gotten used to the train's acceleration, so she staggered and fell forward. She didn't have time to scream. She immediately fell into a stranger's arms and felt the softness of a down feather. She was supported. When she finally lifted her head, she saw a face right in front of her. Her eyes and a faint fragrance. Her mind was completely blank. She actually felt pain and regret in her heart as her heart beat madly. Ah, she's such a perfect beauty, but her body is so pitiful, sorry. She hurriedly got up and felt her nose heat up. She hurriedly covered her face, only to discover that her nose was bleeding. I am going to the bathroom. It was as if she was running away. She rushed towards the end of the corridor without even looking back. Sure was left in a daze. He didn't know what was going on. Black person ? JPG. Her heart was beating madly. She breathed heavily. She raised her hand and splashed the cold water on her face, hoping that she could calm down a little. But every time she closed her eyes, that flawless face appeared in front of her. It was so cold, but it made her heart beat uncontrollably. Calm down, Zhenshi. You're the daughter of the Wu family. You can't be like a love-struck fool. But even so, how could she calm down? She closed her eyes in despair. After staying in the bathroom for half an hour, she finally calmed down a little. Or rather, she finally had the courage to go back. She braced herself and pushed the door open. She was stunned. She didn't know when it started, but the world became silent. Even the distant sound of the train tracks had disappeared. The sound of the air conditioner operating, the broadcast system, and even the voices outside. Everything had disappeared. She felt a little cold. She exhaled a white breath and her fingers were cold. Is the air conditioner broken? When she walked in the aisle, she realized that the passengers around her had disappeared without a trace. She was nowhere to be seen. Is anyone here? She raised her voice and asked timidly. No one responded. There was only a cold and dead silence. When she finally returned to her seat, she found that she was still in the same place. That's right, she was still sitting on the chair. The other her was there, never leaving. But her appearance had changed beyond recognition. It was as if thousands of years had passed in an instant. The clothes that had weathered the vicissitudes of life had long since turned yellow and tattered. All that remained was a pale and broken skeleton. Now, in her line of sight, she saw the dead truth propping up her skull. Rotten black blood flowed out silently from her empty eye socket. Like tears. She was rooted to the ground, unable to move. She wanted to scream subconsciously, but she couldn't make a sound. She almost suffocated in the cold and collapsed to the ground. She used all her strength to move her body backward. She wanted to run and escape. She ran faster and faster. She had never run like this in the track and field club. However, the chill was still chasing after him like maggots in his bones. It even appeared in front of her. When she pushed open the door of the isolation compartment, she saw the skeleton standing in front of her. With black tears, the skeleton stepped forward and looked down at her. With her voice, she asked hoarsely, where are you going? She couldn't speak, couldn't move. In the eternal silence, there was a frightened whimper. Just outside the window, the world had changed. On the barren land, not even a blade of grass grew. In the sky, the blood moon hung high, illuminating the ferocious outline. It was a huge shadow that covered the sky and the earth. The ferocious spider danced in its web, looking down coldly and ferociously. It tightened the rope inch by inch, destroying the soul in the web. It was at that moment that Huaishur sighed and looked up. Sure enough, he couldn't ignore it. He stood up abruptly, took off the sunglasses on his face, and walked straight to the bathroom. At the door of the bathroom, he saw a burly man walking towards him. It was a tall and sturdy man covered in tattoos, who was as strong as a giant bear. Hell's chef demon. Oh? It seems that you're going to do it? He didn't care about the smoke lamp that kept ringing above his head. He smoked a thick cigar and looked at Huaishur with a faint smile. Next to him, the conductor was trying to persuade him to put out the cigarette in a panic. He carelessly pushed her to the side. Suddenly, he took a step back to show his courtesy. Then, I don't need to get involved. The man said, Please, sir, let me see the ability of the cooking demon of Ingzhou. He was far more sensitive than others. No, it should be said that as a cooking demon, he had a perception that was thousands of times sharper than ordinary people. Especially for the aura of his own kind. The moment he met Huaishe, he instinctively knew each other's identity. Huaishe didn't bother to correct the mistake in his words. He raised his hand and pressed on the door of the bathroom. There was a soft creak. The door opened. The force of the drummer's hand was activated in an instant, and the internal structure of the door lock was crushed into dust. The conductor, who had just got up, was stunned. Wait, what are you doing? Hey, don't get in the way. The burly tattooed cooking demon pressed one hand on his shoulder and held him down, not allowing him to interfere. Chapter 6:18. The bear-like burly cooking demon lowered his head and looked at the door lock that Huaishe had broken. His eyes were sparkling. Nice technique. What kind of shelling technique is this? It's rare for the shell to be broken so evenly. Do you have time to talk? Huaishe rolled his eyes and walked into the washroom. He saw the girl who had fainted on the ground. Her consciousness was no longer here. She had sunk into a man-made nightmare. He could foresee that if the origin substance continued to evaporate at this rate, she would soon die of brain death. The cracking sound on the roof seemed to be getting more and more impatient. It was filled with displeasure at the sudden intruder. An invisible lead appeared in front of Huaishe. It was like a thin spider's web. One end was connected to the girl in front of him, while the other end extended upwards into the meticulously created nightmare. Huaishe reached out and pinched the lead. Once you cut it off, the little girl will really die. The burly cooking demon watched the show and kindly reminded Huaishe. However, Huaishe did not respond at all. He touched his nose awkwardly and shook his head. So cold. Are all the women in Ingzhou like this? He looked at the train attendant who was caught. The train attendant was struggling. When he saw the unconscious girl, he wanted to scream and ask for help. Don't spoil the fun, friend. The cooking demon pinched his shoulder lightly with 2 fingers. With a slight force, the nerves of the train attendant were paralyzed, and he could no longer move. If there was another cut, it would be the humane way of handling ingredient. There would be no pain at all. However, such an inferior ingredient would not have any taste, right? He retracted his gaze and looked at the washroom. However, it was a pity that in the short moment he looked, everything had already ended. When Huaishe reached out and pinched the lead, the ending was already decided. At that moment, in the deepest nightmare, Zhen Shi, who was being embraced by death inch by inch, suddenly twitched. In the midst of her dizziness, she heard a sharp explosion. It was like the sound of the sky breaking. The dark sky was torn apart by some kind of violent power, revealing the boundless light of the dream realm, and a pair of cold eyes looking down from the sky. A dark storm swept across, and a violent tide fell from the sky. Just like in the legends, after the sky was broken, the water of the 4 seas fell from the sky. It was a frenzied tide of darkness. However, when the tide dispersed, black metal wings spread out in the sky. Countless scarlet eyes looked down and let out sharp and frenzied cries. Full of hunger, it rushed towards the panicked giant spider. The crow tide that had awakened in the cage of dreams swept out and instantly engulfed the gigantic shadow that covered the sky and the earth. In this illogical nightmare, big and small, far and near, strong and weak were all illogical. All logic was based on the consciousness of both parties. It was rooted in Maki's fear and the creation of the earth spider. This was how it should be, however. This excessively powerful external force had turned everything upside down in an instant. All common sense and rules were torn apart without any reason. What replaced it was a huge greed that even nightmares could not bear, endless hunger and hatred. The time for the hunt had begun. The giant spider shadow was shattered in an instant. A scream came from the top of the car. At that moment, Maki opened her eyes and saw the figure standing in front of her. She could not believe it. What happened to me? She was still immersed in the nightmare. She trembled and could not believe what she saw. Huaishur bent down, reached out, and pulled her up from the ground. His other hand was typing on the phone, telling her, "It's just a nightmare. Drink more warm water." Maki was confused. She could not understand, but she could not resist Huaishur's actions. She was pulled up and sent back to her seat. "Isn't it not over yet?" Behind them, the cooking demon, who had not had a feast for the eyes, suddenly spoke. "There's still work to be done, madam. It's not good to get off work when the ingredients are half processed." As he spoke, he raised his eyes and glanced above his head. Through the roof of the car, they could vaguely hear wails and screams. Someone was running for his life, staggering and running away. Huaishur waved his hand indifferently. He did not care at all. If anything, as soon as he woke up from the nightmare, everything was over. On the top of the car, the monk covered in a long robe was coughing violently. He vomited blood with sticky blood clots. He could not believe it. The nightmare that he had been creating for years was shattered just like that? The hundreds of variations and meticulously designed traps were not used at all, and they were easily burned to ashes from the outside just like that? A great fear descended upon his consciousness, causing him to grit his teeth, urge his exhausted body, and stagger as he ran. Soon, his escape came to an abrupt stop. He froze on the spot, because under the dim moonlight, a fleeting shadow slowly rose from the top of the car. It was shrouded in a bottomless darkness. He could not even see its face or silhouette. He could only see a pair of cold eyes without any warmth. Young Master Ming's shadow looked down at him coldly. Then she understood. Earth Spider? Indeed, it's a waste to let such a good material go. Since you've delivered yourself to me, then I won't be polite. In the hands of the ferocious shadow, countless crow feathers appeared, overlapping into a sharp outline, and aimed at his dull face. "I forgot to tell you," Huaishur said softly. "You didn't put salt in your dream." The light of resentment flashed. Immediately, the screams of the stigmata earth spider were extinguished in the eternal darkness, devoured by the crows buried in the sanctuary. Only a headless corpse fell to the sky. Together with the head, it rolled down the carriage and fell into the weeds on both sides. And just in front of the train, the light of the city lit up. Nara had arrived. 20 minutes later, outside Nara Station, in a 24-hour express restaurant. The girl sitting opposite Huaishur widened her eyes and asked curiously, "Miss Huaishur, are you hungry?" "I'm not hungry." "Then, Miss Huaishur, are you thirsty?" "I'm not thirsty." "At least eat something. Although I don't have much pocket money, I can still treat my savior to a meal." She blinked her big eyes expectantly. "Besides, I still have a lot of things to ask Miss Huaishur." Huaishur sighed, couldn't help but roll his eyes, and raise the phone screen. "You're very annoying." Mom sometimes says that too." Not caring about Huaishur's indifference, she didn't hesitate this time. On the contrary, staying by her side was full of an indescribable sense of security. She felt that she was not afraid of anything. Also, that nightmare, what's going on? Is someone really here to kill me? "Miss Huaishur, how did you do it? You saved me so easily." Huaishur began to regret her actions. Just where did she get such a curious baby? "Isn't that person here to kill you? You should know it yourself, right? The other party should be a resentful monk of Mount Koya. Who did you offend?" To be honest, I didn't expect this. I thought no one would care about a character like me." She's expression stiffened, and her smile became forced. "Although I know about the ascendants, I didn't expect that I would be involved in this kind of thing just by going through the process." "Going through the process?" Huaishur frowned and raised his hand. "Your name?" Shinichi Ryumi." The girl puffed out her chest and introduced herself. 17 years old, a high school student. My hobbies are handcraft and painting. I'm a member of the track and field club. My future dream is to become a kindergarten teacher. I'm working hard for the university entrance exam. No, you don't have to tell me this. Huaishir quickly refused. She was stunned for a moment, and then she understood. Ah, that's right. After all, Miss Huaishir's figure. It's a pity. She's such a beauty, but she can't speak. Sure enough, there's no perfect existence in the world. Thinking that Miss Huaishir had lived alone in such an environment for so many years, she felt like her mother's heart was broken. Huaishir rolled his eyes again, and began to have a headache. He felt that this woman had finally gone crazy, but her surname is Ryumi? That means she's a relative of Hu Po's stinky sister? She's not even a ascender. She looks like a little girl from the countryside. How did she get involved in the struggle for ascenders? And she was even assassinated. What's going on with your family? According to Uncle Yanjing, because the original head of the family, third uncle, has been disqualified by the court officials and has been demoted, the Ryumi family is now without a head. The elders have decided to gather all those who are qualified to inherit the family and choose a new head of the family. Miss Huaishir, don't look at me like this. My family is also very powerful. Nonsense. Look at how you don't know anything. I probably know more about the Ryumi family than you do. You're also here to participate in the selection? It's just going through the process. My father's bloodline is already very thin. Although my name is Ryumi, I grew up in the countryside and have nothing to do with my family. If it weren't for the fact that my father passed away early, this kind of process wouldn't be my turn. Ryumi Maki shyly rubbed her hands together. I thought I could take a few days off and go to Kyoto to play. So, you didn't think about how dangerous the journey would be when you went out. You only thought about going to Kyoto to play after you were done? Huaishir began to admire this person's carelessness. How could you jump into the pit without knowing anything about such a bloody matter? Hu Po's stinky sister even knows how to use money to recruit people and find outside help from Dongxia. Why are you so brave? You're really sending yourself to the door. Huaishir sighed, raised his hand, and asked again. Then, what's going on with the chefs and demons? Do you know about it? I've heard Uncle Yanjing mention this before. Ryumi Maki's eyes lit up. She excitedly moved closer and tried to put on a serious expression. To talk about this, we have to start from a few hundred years ago. It was like the narration of a day drama. The girl said in a sonorous voice. It is said that during the Edo period, in order to compete for the position of the general's imperial chef, the chefs used all kinds of methods to fight for it. It was about to set off a bloody storm, but at this time, the general who heard about it finally spoke. She tried her best to imitate the majesty of a general in an old man's voice. Let's fight fair and square. And so, in that instant, violence was given the rule. With her hands on her hips, Shinichi solemnly declared, "This is the trial of the Imperial Kitchen Demon." Chapter 619. Silence. It was a long silence. Huaishir's face twitched. He raised his phone and asked, I think I understand a little, but did you steal the settings of some manga? Shinichi looked away guiltily. It's easier to understand. Anyway, that's about it. Huaishir thought for a moment and raised his phone again. Are you crazy? No. Shinichi sounded even more guilty this time. In short, it's said that in order to avoid a repeat of the bloodshed between the Wu family and the Gong family decades ago, His Majesty has once again issued an order of mercy on living creatures. All officials are not allowed to kill. If not for this, they wouldn't dare to go out. Shinichi's expression suddenly became gloomy. But I didn't expect that I would still be targeted. It would be strange if I wasn't targeted, right? Even if the conflict between the officials was restricted and the proxy war was used to determine the winner, it only prevented large-scale conflicts on the surface. All conflicts would be hidden in the dark. they would be solved in a crueler and colder way. At the same time, as long as they were not discovered, many people would start to act more crazily. Now that the position of the head of the Rygian family was vacant, many people were staring at it. To be able to survive all the way to the capital and come to Nara on the Shinkansen line before encountering an assassin was already a great stroke of luck. But when he thought about the proxy war between the chef and the demon, Huai Shi was shocked to find that he had become a tool again. But it didn't seem to be anything to be scared of. He was used to it. What did the bloody conflict in Yingzhou have to do with him? Miss Huai Shiki was just a cold and heartless cooking machine. Just when Huai Shi was calmly drinking tea, Shinichi Rygian blinked and came over to him. She looked at him and said, "Miss Huai Shiki, you're also an ascender, right?" Huai Shi didn't even want to answer. "Why don't you come with me to the Rygian family?" Shinichi Rygian grabbed his hand and didn't mind that the cup was hot. The Rygian family must be short of people now. A powerful ascender like you can definitely make a lot of money. I say, Miss Shinichi, I'm just an unknown ascender. Is it really okay for you to invite a wolf into your house? Besides, I've already been hired by your cousin. He was a person with ulterior motives. You're leading the way so smoothly that it's making me a little nervous. Looking at Huai Shi's silent appearance, her expression gradually dimmed. Can't I? I don't care. Huai Shi sighed and raised his phone to tell her. In any case, they would have to deal with each other in the future. He might as well go in and take a look at the situation. While he was at it, he might as well eliminate this silly roe deer in front of him. The sooner he eliminated it, the better. It would be best if he didn't even have the slightest chance of being selected. Miracles attract each other. Similarly, calamities would also occur. For ordinary people, the further away they were from the ascendants, the safer they would be. This was because the higher the level of the stigmata, the greater the distortion it would cause to the surroundings. Don't you see a bunch of Tier 4 and Tier 5 monsters roaming the borders in hell? In the modern realm, once you leave your own area, you would be heavily monitored by the Astronomy Society. It would be like a criminal wearing ankle bracelets. Anyone would feel uncomfortable. Picking up a lousy book had caused his life to deviate so much. As an ordinary person, the deeper Rikumi Maki entered the world of the ascendants, the more unfortunate her fate would be. She didn't even have a soul, so she might inexplicably go crazy when she saw something. The sooner she left the group, the sooner she would be safe. A certain someone who had already turned into a traitor before nodding his head made up his mind. Ah, that's great. Not knowing what Huai Shi was planning, Rikumi Maki jumped up excitedly, almost dancing with joy. Occasionally, she would look at the big sister next to her, unable to hide the joy in her heart. Great, I can spend some time with Miss Kaisha again. Maki, come on, fight. First, set a small goal, get Miss Kaishi's contact information. Let's become good friends. In short, mother far away in my hometown, please bless me. I seem to have fallen in love with a woman. The happy time alone didn't last long. Soon, the silent street was illuminated by car lights. The drowsy waiter woke up, looked at the lights outside the window, and was stunned. The dozen or so expensive luxury cars were parked in front of the fast food restaurant. From the middle of the limousine, a solemn and cold figure walked out. Looking straight ahead, he walked into the restaurant and slowly looked around. The chill spread. The waiter stiffened, gathered his courage, and asked with a trembling voice, "Customer, do you need anything?" The person didn't respond. His eyes fell on the corner of the restaurant, the girl who was chattering to the indifferent traveling companion. At the same time, the indifferent traveling companion finally raised his face and looked over. Even with the person's composure, he couldn't help but be stunned in front of that face for a moment. At the same time, what appeared was not admiration of beauty, but deep fear. And Huai Shi was also looking at him. There was a black eye patch over his left eye. The middle-aged man was wearing a long robe from Yingzhou, which was not suitable for the current era. He didn't have a sword, and he was barehanded. But the hands exposed from the sleeves were covered with scars and calluses. It made people think of a sharp and heavy weapon. His expression was cold. But she seemed to be unaware of this. She rushed forward with great trust and hugged the man's arm. "Uncle Yenjing, you came to pick me up?" "You've had a hard journey, Miss Jinshi." Yenjing's mouth slightly raised a smile, and finally there was an expression. But soon, he walked to Huaishe. "I'm Yenjing from Jiao Village, Yenjing from Jiao Village." The middle-aged man bowed and thanked him seriously. "I've heard the details, thank you for saving Miss Jinshi." It seemed that in just a few minutes, he figured out what happened. He invited, "It's late now, if you don't mind, please rest in my house for a night. That way we can express our gratitude." Huaishe nodded and got up. When they brushed past each other, he raised his eyebrows slightly. There was a bloody smell on this man. The smell of fresh death. Although the Rigian family's territory was in the Kotoyama area, it didn't extend to today's Nara. But in the center of this area where the noble families gathered, there were still many industries. The convoy drove all the way out and took them directly to a Ingzhou-style manor outside the city to settle down. Along the way, she shouted like a village girl and even took photos with her mobile phone. She couldn't hide the smell of the countryside at all. Even the servants next to her couldn't help but snicker. On the contrary, when facing Miss Huaishe, they felt a headache and trembled with fear. It was probably because she seemed to be expressionless all the time. She was never surprised by everything in front of her, nor did she have any admiration, let alone envy. Even when looking at the landscape of the courtyard that was designed and maintained by the famous chef, and when the famous chef served dinner, she didn't show any emotion. On the contrary, she was emitting a kind of pressure all the time. There was a faint trace of disappointment in his voice. "That's it? Brother, are you kidding me?" Yenjing Jiaoshan accompanied her the whole time and secretly observed her, but found that this coldness was not fake at all. On the contrary, when dinner was over, he called the musician who was performing in the hall and wanted to hear the old man's impression of her, but he heard an unexpected answer from the other party. "That lady should be a noble with a high status, right?" The old musician thought for a moment and answered seriously, "With so many years of experience serving guests, I can't help but feel afraid. Even when I played for the emperor's emissaries and the noble officials, I didn't feel such pressure." Yenjing Jiaoshan was silent. After a long time, he nodded and waved his hand to signal him to leave. Then he got up and walked to the small building at the back of the manor. After passing through many verifications, the final paper door opened in front of him. Behind the door, the room was dimly lit, illuminating the retainers sitting around the long table. Sitting at the head of the table was the retainer, Inu Jiang, who was now fully in charge of the affairs of the Rigian family. When he saw Yenjing Jiaoshan enter, he waved his hand and motioned for him to sit. "Sorry for making you wait, I'm late." Yenjing Jiaoshan sat down and said, "I just brought Miss Jinshi back, something happened." "Qing Ping's daughter?" Yenjing Jiaoshan nodded. "Is the problem serious?" Inu Jiang frowned. "I remember that Qing Ping only has one daughter, nothing happened, right? It has been settled by someone." Yenjing Jiaoshan got up, took a step back and then knelt down again. He sat down and asked for forgiveness. "It is my responsibility to leak the news of Miss Jinshi." "Forget it, who doesn't want to sit in the position of the head of the family? Even if it is the weakest competitor, if you can get rid of them, you must act decisively. Hey, that group of kids back then, one by one, they have become like this." Inu Jiang shook his head coldly. It was hard to tell whether it was praise or disdain. As for Jinshi, he just sighed in pity. "She must be scared? If it wasn't for the looming hall ordering us to gather all the bloodlines, how could she be involved in this? With the blood of the Wu family, being weak is the original sin." He had seen too many similar tragedies. After understanding the situation, Inu Jiang asked, That woman called Huaiji, have you found out the details? Not yet. It is said that she is a student of the Ivory Tower, but I always feel that there is something wrong, and it doesn't seem like a chance encounter. Whether it is a chance encounter or an ulterior motive, since she came to Rygian House, she is a guest of Rygian House. Don't let others laugh at Rygian House for having no etiquette. Inu Jiang pondered for a moment and said, treat her well, then give her a generous gift and send her away. Now is an eventful time, it is not convenient for her to stay for long. In the silence, someone suddenly asked, what if she doesn't leave? Inu Jiang did not answer. What else did he need to answer? If he couldn't drive her away, she would be an evil guest. This topic ended here. Next was the urgent matter that needed to be solved before the heirs arrived. Jiaoshan, how is the investigation of the murderous demon? Chapter 620. Since half a month ago, there had been a series of murders in Nara City. Every night, a decapitated corpse would appear on the street. For half a month, there was not a single day of interruption. There were rich traces of origin substance left at the scene. Without a doubt, it was done by an ascendant. Including today, 16 people's heads had been chopped off. The identities of the dead were irregular. There were ordinary office workers, ascendants, and even an attendant of a minister, but the ending was undoubtedly the same. Their necks were cut off by the same mistake. They gave death cleanly and then turned around and left without any reluctance, not leaving any clues for the pursuers. They mysteriously melted into the night. Only a tragic scene and full of ridicule was left. Horn Mountain lowered his head in shame. I'm incompetent. I'm a step late again. He was so close to catching that guy's tracks. Continue to investigate, Inu Jiang said. Now that such a big mess has happened in the city before the start of the Imperial Chef Demon Duel, I'm afraid that the looming hall will use this as a pretext to make a fuss and say that we have failed in our duty, heh. A disdainful sneer came from below. Wasn't this sent by them? Inu Jiang raised his eyes and looked over. Jiu Lang, am I wrong, Mr. Inu Jiang? The young man whispered angrily. They single-handedly forced the death of the uncle who begged for his life for the Riken family back then, and now they're hypocritically accusing us of failing in our duty? They want to accuse us. Jiu Lang. Inu Jiang raised his voice and raised his old eyes. He warned word by word, this is not something you can interrupt. The young man stubbornly raised his head and asked, am I not a warrior of the Riken family? If it was 200 years ago, a warrior of the Riken family would have been ordered to commit seppuku if he dared to say such ungrateful words here. Inu Jiang coldly retorted, you're not the master yet. Wait until you sit in that position, then think about how to give orders to us old men. Now, before I get angry, go back to your room. This is not a place for you to behave atrociously. Jiulang's face flushed red. Soon, he lowered his head and left. The door closed. Beside Quan Jiang, the old warrior sighed. Jiulang died in grief. He was still young and had no intention of offending you. Who doesn't know? Quan Jiang shook his head and sighed. Otherwise, if it was someone with ulterior motives, I would have cut off his head in front of all of you. Jiulang, Lijian Jingjiang, was the nephew of the previous generation's Lijian Boer. Rygian Fuji didn't have any children of his own. Since Jiulang was young, Rygian Fuji treated him as his own child. And after the previous generation's master was demoted and died of shame, the one who suffered the most was undoubtedly him. Now that the young people had said such rude words, the old people could understand, but they couldn't indulge them. Driving him away was already the greatest protection he could offer. The meeting must continue. After settling the remaining trivial matters, Quan Jiang tiredly raised his hand to rub the bridge of his nose. He closed his eyes and sighed. Picking up a towel, he casually wiped his face and forced himself to stay alert. He was already old, 164 years old. He had almost witnessed the recent history of the Rygian family. From an unknown warrior, he gradually became Quan Jiang, who inherited the name of the 8 Dogs of Rigian. It could be said that in addition to being the master, this old man was the real backbone of the Rigian family. And Quan Jiang had always been trusted by the previous masters because of his restraint of power and loyalty to the family. The generations that grew up after experiencing the age of turmoil, no matter how ambitious they were, understood how important the existence of the family was. Only by being closely united and seeking survival together could they survive in the increasingly dangerous situation. Unfortunately, the young people today didn't think like that. Since the previous generation, the struggle had been out of control. Now, as the general gradually took over the emperor, everyone in the entire Yingzhou was swaying in the huge political vortex. It was difficult for them to control themselves. No, it should be said that the moment the country's door was opened by the Black Ship of Rome, the era had changed. After resting for a moment, he forced himself to stay alert and looked at the 7 people around him. The 8 Dogs of Rigian. Now, the 8 retainers of the Rigian family who held different rights, after losing the master, the 8 people who could represent the Rigian family were all here. After a few days, I believe everyone already has a list in their hearts, right? In the silence, the warriors who were no longer young slowly nodded and shared the information they had investigated. In the end, they might become the next master. At the front, needless to say, was the adopted son of the previous master, Jiulang, Rigian Jiujing. Then, it was the younger brother of the previous master, Rigian Jiu, who had hurriedly returned from America. The person in charge of Rigian Jiaguanshan Group, Rigian Jiujing. Rigian Zhengping from the Russian Federation. In the end, the last son of the Rigian family, Rigian Hupu. It's ridiculous! During the banquet, an elder roared angrily. The daughter of a sinner who betrayed Yingzhou and was exiled to Dongxia, the looming hall actually recognized her talent? A bunch of idiots! What on earth are those guys thinking? Quan Jiang raised his eyes and said calmly, Hu Po's father is also someone who sacrificed for the family. In my opinion, she's no different from the other juniors. They're all children of the Rigian family. Mr. Quan Jiang, don't you understand why she's here? Could it be that her purpose is different from the other people's? Quan Jiang raised his voice and asked back. He looked around solemnly. Since she's the blood of the Rigian family, she's qualified to inherit the position of the master of the Rigian family. Everyone, don't lose your duty. Everyone lowered their eyes respectfully and no longer objected. In the silence, Quan Jiang suddenly couldn't help but sneer at himself. He was the one who exiled Hupa back then. At this moment, the others probably scolded him for being old and confused, right? But at the same time, in his eyes, there was no difference between Rigian Hupu and the other juniors. As for why the looming hall would recognize her bloodline and an exiled person in the Social Security Bureau, he could roughly understand the consideration behind it. There was no other reason. It was simply the balance of 2 evils. It wasn't because of some noble and pitiful reason to give a sinner a chance to prove themselves and atone for their sins. It wasn't because they believed that Hupa would emerge from the mud without being stained. It was purely because she reaped what she sowed. The result of having no power outside and gradually losing control inside. Denying the blood of the Chinese and rejecting the infiltration of the Dongxia lineage, which result was more serious. No matter what Rigian Hupa did, there was no doubt that she had the direct bloodline of the master of the Rigian family. At the same time, she was the Orthodox Chinese. As for the possibility of colluding with external powers, were there few people who colluded with external powers? Each and every one of them was like a wanderer waiting for a good price. It was despicable. And now, among the successors of the Rigian family, who knew how much sand had been mixed in, who knew how many people had already chosen a side for themselves, General, His Majesty, various ministers, and even others in a mess. When they chose the cooking demon to represent them in the duel, They themselves had already become the representatives of others. But what does this have to do with us old people? Quan Jiang lowered his eyes and lowered his head to look at the bland tea in the cup, shaking his head mockingly. You say it as if the Rigian family can still decide on their own. He made it sound as if the real House of Insight could still exist after this turmoil. He closed his eyes. He sighed tiredly. The next day, noon. In the Ingzhou-style banquet hall, there was complete silence. It was clearly the most lively time for lunch, but the people sitting behind each seat were expressionless. Those old people were eating in silence, and when the young people looked at each other, their eyes seemed to be able to produce sparks. It was clearly a banquet meticulously prepared by a famous chef, but it was tasteless. Only a country bumpkin was still wolfing down his food and surfing Twitter mindlessly. He was so amused by the funny artist that he burst into laughter. After eating, he wiped his mouth and slowly moved to the side of the beauty next to him like a hamster. He tugged at her sleeve. Miss Huaiji, Miss Huaiji, I heard there's a hot spring behind. She blinked her big curious eyes. After lunch, let's go to the hot spring together. Under the strange eyes of the others, Huai sure couldn't help but want to sigh. Miss Jinshi, is Ning as stupid as the Rigian family? No, why can't you learn to read the air that you Ingzhou people are so proud of? Let me take a good look at the atmosphere. Hot spring? If I were a competitor, I would have used up all the hot spring water and replaced it with sulfuric acid. Although he was complaining about Jinshi's carelessness in his heart, he still maintained a dignified look on the surface. He ate his meal slowly, his posture was elegant, and his movements were graceful. No matter how harsh the standard was to judge, it was impossible to find any flaw in that pleasing posture. Today's Miss Huaiji was still perfect. She was only wearing the guest bathrobe sent by the attendants, but it was as if she was wearing a gorgeous tang suit, constantly exuding an indescribable charm to the surroundings. The iconic cowherd business smile that he learned from old Lu was changed here. The green was better than the master, forming a smile that made it difficult for people to look away. Especially when he looked at the end of the table, at a certain stinky sister that he hadn't seen for a long time, it made him even happier. Thinking up to this point, he secretly took out his phone and sent an email over with a wicked sense of humor. Dear Hu Po, I'm here. In the crowd, under the cold, hostile gazes of many blood relatives, Hu Po was still eating calmly when he noticed the vibration of his phone on the table. He looked down. Then his eyeballs almost fell out. The hand that was holding the rice trembled. Where the hell are you? Your home, your bed is so big and comfortable. Hu Po felt like he was upside down. He couldn't understand what was happening at all. What kind of stupid thing was this guy saying? Am I behind the times? What kind of joke is this? Are you going to stop being a cowherd and talk about Luoyu? Well, no, this is the truth. I arrived 3 days early and then your family invited me over. They treated me well with good food and drinks, warm and hospitable, much better than the cold treatment of a poor little girl. Are you jealous? Are you King kidding me? She typed a greeting without hesitation, but before she could finish, she froze for a moment and realized that something was wrong. The atmosphere around them changed. Just as she and Huai Shi were focused on connecting the lines, the gazes around them gradually became strange. Astonishment, confusion, shock, confusion, and greed. No, they weren't looking at her, but behind her? She frowned and finally heard a soft breathing behind her. She turned around abruptly and saw a face that was inches away. A pair of big, watery eyes, flirtatious and pure, like a white lotus that bloomed in green tea. Wearing a green bathrobe, the woman who had arrived at some point in time knelt behind Hu Po. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail that fell over her left shoulder. She raised her hand and tucked her hair behind her ear. Her smile was gentle. But for Hu Po, the horror came suddenly, accompanied by the horror of the past and the memories of despair that rose in her heart. She was so frightened that she almost jumped on the spot, wanting to draw her sword. Luo Xian? No, this is, at that moment, under everyone's gaze. Miss Huaishe bent down slightly and intimately leaned close to her ear, greeting her with a deep voice that she hadn't heard in a long time. Are you stupid, stupid sister? Chapter 6:21. One day, under the cold and hostile gazes of her family members, in a family that she was already unfamiliar with, Hoopa suddenly met a stunning beauty that she had never seen before. Then, this beauty walked towards her with a smile that was thick with shadows. Beside her ear, she used an extremely familiar and annoying voice to say, "Are you dumbfounded, stinky sister?" It was as if she had been punched in the chin. Even Hoopa couldn't help but feel her vision go black. She was utterly defeated in front of this overly fantastical reality. She was dumbfounded. What the hell? She felt like she was going to split open. Similarly, little True Hope felt like she was going to split open. Right in front of her, at the other end of the long table, the person she had a crush on and her cousin, whom she hadn't seen for many years, were leaning against each other. They were so intimate, chatting and laughing, and even seemed to be talking, so happy, so familiar. As if they were a match made in heaven. And she was just a stinky brother who didn't even have the chance to be a third party. She curled up in the corner and couldn't help but want to wipe her tears. So petty. Then, in front of everyone's eyes, the two girls who were warm and harmonious with each other smiled and whispered to each other. They could no longer hide each other's evil natures. Stinky brother, you've done it. You've finally gone to Thailand? Crawl, this is called killing both men and women. Huaishe lowered his face and whispered in her ear, "Stinky sister, are you jealous?" There was a soft smack. Under the table, under the sleeves of the bathrobe, two palms had already collided. The 5 fingers were separated, the fingertips were intertwined, and the palms were pressed together. Under the seemingly intimate posture, the muscles under the bathrobe were flowing like water. In the silence, bursts of increasingly strong power erupted. Like arm wrestling, tightly clenched together. In the silence, thunder clashed. It was as if she couldn't wait to crush the other person to death here. Out of Huaishe's expectations, his palm was actually blocked. It was as if she had a thorough understanding of all his skills and understood all the changes in his movements. In close proximity, Hoopa's beautiful face was filled with a mocking smile. "Drummer? Don't forget that I entered the orchard earlier than you, little brother." Smack. Before she finished speaking, her shoulder suddenly shook and her joints rubbed against each other. An enormous power erupted in an instant, destroying her control and counterattack. She regained control of the situation. He pinned her wrists to the ground. "That's it? That's it? That's all?" Huaishe chuckled. "Then wouldn't I have to clean up the sect on behalf of the founder today?" Although she said that, she didn't tear apart the disguise of intimacy between the two of them. Instead, she took the initiative to let go of her hand. After all, he wasn't a demon. How could he do anything to the pitiful little Amber in public? In the past few years, Hoopa's teamwork had improved at an incredible speed. Huaishe was afraid that if this continued, he would fail. After all, his specialty wasn't in the field of hand-to-hand combat. If he really had a dagger, he would have killed his stinky sister in 2 rounds. How would he give her the chance to be arrogant? "All right, if you think you can do it, let's have a try." Hoopa spoke into Huaishe's ear in Dongxia language, with a strong regional accent. "Don't leave after eating if you dare." The fight was over. Miss Huaizhi, who had won, snorted in disdain. She got up with a smile and left, leaving the loser behind to return to her seat. Then, she noticed that she was still petrified. She didn't know what had happened. "Are you sick?" No, I'm not." She seemed to be shocked. She hurriedly shook her head and looked at Miss Huaizhi beside her. Then, she looked at her cousin, Hoopa, who she hadn't seen for a long time. Her gaze moved back and forth. After a long time, she gathered her courage and asked, Miss Huaiji, you can talk, right? Huai sure wanted to roll his eyes. So, is that what you're paying attention to? Shouldn't you be suspecting that there's something going on between me and Hupa? Shouldn't you feel that you no longer trust me? How can I only talk? I can also sing, dance, play the piano, and play the cello. None of those are things that you can handle. He thought for a moment and replied on his phone, If I say something to you, you might not be able to handle it. She was confused. It was hard to understand. She didn't understand why she wouldn't be able to handle it. But when she remembered that Miss Huaiji was a sublimator, and she seemed to be one of the stronger sublimators, she suddenly seemed to understand. I understand now. Could this be the silent meditation that her father once talked about? Through the cultivation of not listening, not seeing, not speaking, and not moving, what kind of secret method could one achieve? Just by speaking to a normal person, that person's worldview would shatter, their soul would be impacted, and they would spit out blood and die. That sounds amazing. She gave a thumbs up and praised in admiration, as expected of Miss Huaiji. Huai sure was speechless. Although he didn't know what she understood, he decided to let her be. After thinking for a while, he wrote on his phone again, Also, I have something to do in the afternoon, so I won't be going to the hot springs. She was stunned for a moment. Her originally expectant expression dimmed. If it was Huai sure, he would say, Don't write everything on your face. Your expression is too easy to understand. He sighed and continued writing, Don't just think about having fun. Come with me. Okay, I'm always free. In an instant, Shi's spirit was lifted. Her eyes lit up and she nodded vigorously. There seemed to be an invisible little tail wagging crazily behind her back. What's wrong with this woman? Huai sure sighed. He suddenly felt a headache coming on. Why is it that the people who meet here are all so strange? In the afternoon, in the manor's overly spacious courtyard, Huai sure finally found an opportunity to officially meet his employer under the shade of a tree. Although the two of them still exchanged a few words as usual, the topic eventually came back to work. But why did you bring her along? Hupo's expression was indescribable as he looked behind Huai sure in the distance. In the corner of the courtyard, there was a little girl who was excitedly squatting in front of the fish pond and playing with goldfish. We'll talk about her later. Let's talk about you first. Huai sure sighed. The cage of dreams in his hand shook a little. Wisps of faint mist spread out and set up a layer of the simplest illusion to slightly conceal the environment inside. Although he wasn't very proficient in the dream world, he was still able to slightly modify the scene. In the eyes of others, the two of them were just talking under the shade of a tree. Huai sure had already sat down on the ground. He lifted the hem of his bathrobe and scratched the itch on his calf. Then, he took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. Finally, he didn't have to worry about disguising himself anymore. Tell me, what's going on with your family? It's like there's a problem with each family. Speaking of this, Hupo was no longer in the mood to mock Huai sure. His expression became disdainful. What else could it be? It's a problem left behind by history. The sins of the ancestors of the past few generations can only be repaid by the descendants. Since 200 years ago, the Rigian family was famous for not taking side. They relied on their special status and power to please both sides. They didn't want to offend either side. When others were fighting until their heads bled, they would just watch from the side. However, in the eyes of both sides, the bastards of the Rigian family were traitors who repeatedly jumped between the Wu family and the Gong family. They saw it and hated it in their hearts. They wrote it down on paper and made a list long ago, a few decades ago. When the Rigian family began to repeatedly jump between the two sides again, they found that they jumped in the wrong place this time. The general who was exiled from America didn't care what the Rigian family was. Traitors had to die. In order to protect the family, The head of the previous generation had no choice but to offer his head as an apology. And now, the head of the previous generation was hated by the emperor because he was close to the general. The life of the Rhigian family was too bumpy and complicated. Due to various reasons, they had fallen to their current state. They had become an empty shell. Just by looking at the candidates for the head of the family, you can tell that the Rhigian family is hopeless. Hoopa sneered. Other than the emperor and the general exerting their influence, Rome, America, Russia, Dongsha, except for the Indians who don't have much initiative and the Egyptians who like to be autistic, almost all the other major families have a hand in it. The strongest competitor, the adopted son of the previous generation's head, Jiulang, Rhigian Jing Jiang. Oh no, I have to call him Jiu Jing now. After my second uncle died, he changed his name. Now, he has fully sided with the general. The supporter behind him is the American capital that has long been drooling over the Rhigian family's Kansan port, Honest Man Shipping. Huaishur raised his eyebrows. Just like how Honest Monk wasn't honest at all, Honest Man Shipping wasn't an honest man either. If they were really kind and honest, they wouldn't be a giant trust company that controlled more than 40% of the border and logistics. At the same time, the elders in the family had already taken his side when they saw injustice. The current Jiu Jing could be said to be the most legitimate and most popular successor to the head of the family. And the head of the Rhigian family's Kansan group, Rhigian Bujing, who controlled the family's internal financial power, secretly colluded with the looming mansion. At the same time, he had dealings with Rome's Minerva technology. The big brother Rhigian Jinping, who interrupted his study in the Russian Federation and hurriedly returned, supported by the Russian Federation's Constantine Trading Group. In Hu Po's concise introduction, Huaishur quickly straightened out the complicated situation in the Rhigian family. It was like layers of matryoshka dolls. The agent companies that had deep relationships with the major families chose their agents in Yingzhou, and then the agents of the agents found their helpers to fight the agent war for them. It was really F***king enough. It's time to ban matryoshka dolls. Huaishur pinched the cigarette and looked up at her. Then, what about you? Suanio can't let you come empty-handed, right? Hoopa glanced at him and didn't hide it. She answered directly. Taiching Heavy Industries. Chapter 622. It really was a meeting of the gods. Taiching Heavy Industries. It was a famous military cooperation enterprise in Dongsha. It was a giant heavy industry group created by the previous generation's master, Lu Wu. It was a huge capital consortium that spanned across the present world, the border, and hell. Huaishur's expression twitched. He suddenly slapped his bare knee and said in a trembling voice, "Old Tai, this is not easy to handle. You have to pay more." "That's not easy to handle?" Hoopa glanced at him and snorted. "There's something even more difficult to handle." "I can't believe it. What did you do, you bastard?" She glared at Huaishur with resentment. Finally, she looked at the back of a person who was happily playing with goldfish by the pond. She let out a long sigh. She had nothing left to lose. "Forget it. Since you've gained her trust, then you can be Zhen Shi's agent," she said. "I'm afraid she doesn't trust anyone here other than you." Huaishur's smile disappeared and gradually turned cold. "I refuse." "Don't worry. I'll give you the money and remuneration. I know what you're thinking, Hoopa, but you better save it." Huaishur said coldly, "She's just an ordinary person. You can't push her into this fire pit." "Huaishur, from the moment you saved her, she was already destined to be a thorn in other people's side. At least she's not mine. She shouldn't be yours either. She's your blood relative, Hoopa. She can't be the head of the family and can't even be your competitor. It's too easy to kill her." Hoopa retorted, "It's not easy for her to stay alive." Huaishur frowned. "What do you mean?" Hoopa didn't say anything. It was as if she suddenly realized that she had made a mistake. She looked at Huai Shi and was stunned, as if she couldn't believe it. So you really didn't do anything, Huai Shi? She didn't know if that expression was of admiration or change of opinion. It was very unbelievable. She leaned closer and asked seriously, "You guys didn't sleep?" "Stinky sister, don't treat me as a sex maniac." Huai Shi was furious. "All right, let's not talk about the gossip outside. For the time being, we'll just assume that you're an upright person." Hu Pa sighed. "If you've taken off her clothes, you'll know." "Huai Shi, she's a mixed breed." Huai Shi's movements suddenly became sluggish. "Bastard?" He thought for a long time before he remembered that this was the name given to those with beastly characteristics. Part of the mutation phenomenon would only appear in newborns at the border that was too deep, but how could this have anything to do with a country girl like Zhen Shi? "She didn't tell you, did she?" Hu Pa smoked irritably and said in a muffled voice, "I'm afraid that only Jiaoshan knows about this. After all, it's a family scandal. Her father, my uncle Qin Ping, was infected by the abyss. She was unlucky and won a prize. It was a passive inheritance, and she was sent to a remote border area from the moment she was born. If it wasn't for the patriarch's selection, I'm afraid she wouldn't have been able to come out from there. This is her only chance, Huai Shi. Have you seen how most mixed breeds live?" Hu Pa lowered his head and said softly, "They aren't protected by the three great mysteries, and have to endure the corrosion of the abyss in their bodies at all times. If they can't become a sublimator, then they'll die at the age of 50, 40, or even earlier because their origin form will collapse. But most people aren't that lucky. Before that, all kinds of complications will begin to torment them. Spondylitis, diabetes, lupus erythematosus, rheumatism. Starting from the immune system, they'll be tormented. In the end, if they don't want to be dehydrated, they'll have to calculate every single grain of salt they eat 3 times. Most people can't take this kind of torture and commit suicide." "How old is Zhen Shi now?" Huai Shi thought for a moment and said, 17. "Then it'll be soon." Hu Pa sighed softly. Once puberty ended, the pathological period would begin. From then on, it would be a long and painful downhill slope, all the way to hell. "She doesn't have any other choice, Huai Shi." Hu Pa shook his head. "She didn't come here for the free 10-day tour of the capital. No matter how stupid a person is, they know how dangerous this is. But if she wants a way out, she'll have to risk her life. Otherwise, the only thing that awaits her is a tragic death at the age of 30 or 40, just like that uncle of mine. If you ask me, that bastard shouldn't have had children in the first place." Hu Pa stamped out the cigarette but with his foot, his expression dark. "It's fine if you're the only one suffering, but why do you have to implicate the next generation?" In the silence, Huai Shi suddenly said, "I can send her to the ivory tower." Hu Pa sneered. "Like raising a pet? It's not easy to live in a sterile room, Huai Shi." Just as she was about to mock him, Huai Shi raised his head and looked at her. His sharp senses picked up on what she didn't say. "Is there a way for her to live?" Hu Pa's expression stiffened. It was hard for her to understand from the bottom of her heart why this bastard's sense of smell would be unreasonably sharp every time it involved a beautiful woman. After a long silence, she finally chose to tell him the family's secret. "Have you heard of the legend of the 8 dogs in the south?" Huai Shi shook his head decisively. "What's that?" Hu Pa couldn't help but roll her eyes. "With your level of education, how did you become a teacher in the ivory tower?" To put it simply, it's the legend of the Rigian family's ancestors. It's said that at the most dangerous moment of the Rigian family, a miracle called Yatsafusa descended from the sky and turned into a dog. It blessed 8 warriors and helped the head of the Rigian family to successfully restore the country. She said, although most of it is just a rumor, the Yatsafusa itself is real. This was the true treasure of the Rigian family. The most precious secret treasure. The stigmata relic, the glazed armor of Faketzel Yatsafusa. In addition to inheriting the power of the stigmata of the 12 pharmacists' divine generals, it also had the indestructible defense of the Vajra region. Other than the indestructible glazed sword, it was also the guarantee that the family could continue to pass down the family's legacy. Without relying on the quota of the Astronomy Association, every 100 years, 8 people would be able to become ascendants without any repercussions. After explaining the full effects of the family's treasure, Hupo promised, "Why sure, as long as I become the head, she will be the next generation of Yatsafusa warrior. Only by becoming an ascendant can the abyss erosion on her body be neutralized without any repercussions. This is the best way. Other than that?" Huaishur asked directly. "You're the one who will gain more, right?" "Yes." Hupa nodded. "To control the Rigian family, I need someone with a clean background, someone who can be trusted to bear part of the responsibility for me. Is there anyone more suitable than Makoto?" Huaishur shook his head. "Are you so sure that she will cooperate with you? If she is so easily controlled, why won't she be affected by others? You're the one who brought her to me, aren't you?" Hupa laughed softly. "Mystic Bird is right. The greatest opportunity lies with the first person to arrive. In fact, the original plan was not like this, but there was a prerequisite to consider who would appear in front of me first. According to Mystic Bird's suggestion, if it was the original, the final result would either be great fortune or great misfortune. There were no other options. But if it was you, the Rigian family would still have a chance to be saved. I finally understand what he meant. Mystic Bird, a suggestion from the king of the pedigree, one could understand the weight of it. Especially for someone like Mystic Bird, who became more and more sinister as he got older. He was a person who calculated 10 steps ahead of him, and could make a 1,000-layer pancake when others went up a level. Huaishur could not find any reason to refute him. If it were anyone else, Huaishur might be afraid and jump over the wall to escape, afraid that he would be used as cannon fodder, but Mystic Bird was too lazy to play this game. That old man was extremely cautious. His style was so stable that there were no loopholes or shortcomings. His divination skills were even more frightening. Between a sure profit and no loss, he could firmly occupy the latter and maintain a relatively small profit. Only he would never take any big risk. As a tool of the Dongsha pedigree, at least his safety was guaranteed. There was no such thing as being unlucky and suddenly dying on the road. But the problem was, what does he want to do? Huaishur asked. "I don't know." Hupa shrugged. "But it definitely has nothing to do with the Astronomy Society or the Ivory Tower. It won't affect you at all. Or do you think this is Mystic Bird's scheme?" As she spoke, she could not help but glance in the direction of the capital. Her tone became somewhat mocking. "For this kind of thing, there's no such thing as a one-sided passion." Huaishur sighed. "You're willing to be a puppet? Don't make it sound so bad. I'm just a tool." Hupa waved her hand indifferently. "Isn't this what a warrior is like? What's the difference between being a tool of the emperor and a general and being a tool of the Dongsha pedigree?" Moreover, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked, "If the Continuation Institute now sets Exan high as a lockdown area, what will you do, Huaishur? Refuse to carry it out?" Huaishur was silent. He had no answer. If the situation was serious enough to require the Continuation Institute to lock down the area, he was afraid there was no room for him to refuse. "Isn't that right? The hairtail distributed by the Social Security Bureau every year is not that easy to eat, Huaishur." Hupa crumpled the empty 7-star box into a ball and casually threw it into the trash can at the other end of the courtyard. She clapped her hands and looked at Zhenshi, who was beside the pond. Zhenshi noticed their gazes and also looked over. In her hand was a plastic bag holding a goldfish that she had fished out from her pond. She was excitedly waving at Huaishur to show off the fruits of her labor. Hearing Huaishur's pained sigh, This time it was Hoopoe's turn to gloat. Go and have a good discussion with your next employer. Hoopoe patted him on the shoulder and turned to leave. I'll leave the matters of life and death to you, Mr. Toole. A real beautiful girl just needs to sit there and wait for someone to deliver the fruits of her labor. Little Hoopoe snorted happily and turned to leave. Did you see that, stinky little brother? This is the joy and victory of a rich woman. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.